Welcome everyone to our 7th Exit Strategy Workshop. I'm Angus Armstrong, Director of Rebuilding Macroeconomics, which is funded by the ESRC. The purpose of our Exit Strategy Workshops is to explore some of the macroeconomic issues that have arisen while the country finds itself in these economic circumstances. And consistent with our objective, we are particularly interested in interdisciplinary research and new methods, which is why we don't have panels of economists, but also bring people in from different disciplines. Our next Exit Strategy Workshop after this one is on Friday, the 5th of June at a slightly less sociable time of 4 till 7 p.m., led by Professor Doyne Farmer and Dr. Francois Lafond. That is on global production networks and the pandemic. They posted quite an influential paper on the relevance of global production networks to the UK economy and its exit strategy workshop, exit strategy, on our website last week. And that's at that time because most of the people joining are from the west coast of the States. You'd be very welcome to come to that. Of course, you can find all of the details on our website. And Rebuilding Macroeconomics is also at the Global Solutions Summit next week, where we have a panel with Wendy Carlin, Paul Collier, and Alan Kerman to discuss rebuilding macroeconomics and its relevance to the G20. Back to today's event, I'm delighted to hand over to Dame Henrietta Moore, who is my colleague, I'm very pleased to say now, on our management group. And the title is Post-COVID Jobs and the Quest for Better Jobs. Henrietta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Angus. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Henrietta Moore. I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London. And as Angus said, I am one of his colleagues on Rebuilding Macroeconomics. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon. So let me just say that for those of you who don't know, at the Institute for Global Prosperity, or the IGP as we call it, we're interested in redesigning prosperity for the 21st century. And a large part of the work is focused on how we build the economies of the future. That's repurposing our economies to deliver quality of life, secure livelihoods, and economic and social well-being for people and planet. So today's event is, as Angus said, an interdisciplinary event. And the discussions will be focused on how we should reform our economic systems to create and sustain better jobs and more secure livelihoods. How will we come out of the COVID-19 crisis and how will we go forward? What many are now calling building back better. And a key element here is how we bring people back to better work, aligned with the major social, political and economic challenges of the day. And that's really about, we think in rebuilding economics, really about creating an economy of purpose that delivers on societal goals. And how should we do that? By now, it's pretty clear to all of us that the ongoing public health and socioeconomic crisis brought forth by COVID-19 has led to an unprecedented loss of work. And the lockdown and social isolation measures have laid bare the flaws of our current social contract and also brought the effectiveness of all our safety nets across the world, even where they existed, into focus. So it's not just that we are dealing with a set of crises around employment and work, though, because we have such a differentiated picture of the impact of COVID to take account of. We've had a lot of press recently about how different communities have been differentially affected, how social inequality interacts with the impact of COVID-19. But when we look at the scale of what we're dealing with, we see that we have to take account not only of the extraordinary figures that we're faced with, but with the very differentiated character of actually what's going on. So if we look at the United Kingdom, for example, The Bank of England now warning that GDP will contract by about 25% in the second quarter. And more than 30% of the UK workforce are receiving government wage subsidies, with more than 8 million people on the government furlough scheme. So how will we deal with this crisis of unemployment, with unemployment heading towards 7%? Obviously, when we look at different sectors, as we come out of the post-COVID-19 crisis, we see that different sectors are going to be differentially affected. So there's been a lot of talk about how transport, retail, tourism, construction, personal services, and indeed the arts will be amongst those sectors which are most affected. But the question is, how do we make them come back better? At the moment, those sectors across the whole of the OECD account for about 40% of total employment. So that's a huge set of issues to be addressed. But within those sectors, we see difference again, because about 75% of those sectors are actually, in terms of jobs, coming from small and medium enterprises. And the crisis has revealed the extreme vulnerability of these very small businesses. So, of course, whilst governments have moved very swiftly to support them through wage subsidies, which we've talked about, deferral of taxes and payments and loan guarantees and grants, it's very clear that many of these small, medium and enterprises and the entrepreneurs that sustain them are going to go out of business. So it's not just how we might rebound from the crisis, but how might we actually have to reignite business creation? And when we think of reigniting business creation, we have a rather different problem from one that's just about managing the labour market. So most of the policies that we actually see governments exploring up to now have been about saving the past rather than creating the future. Although two possible exceptions here, if we're talking about small and medium enterprise, might be Ireland and Korea, because they've actually been focusing on how to help small businesses adapt to new work processes, to speed up digitalization, and to find new markets. In other words, they have been thinking about how to create the economy of the future based on the reigniting of businesses that have been lost. But it's not just what we might lose in terms of business, it's also, or indeed just the unevenness of how we come out of this situation, but it's also about how we leapfrog towards a new economy, as the phrase is becoming popular. It's how we can work on the fact that although many EU governments have committed to a green and inclusive economy going forward, and there's just been a new report published in the UK in the last couple of days, how is it possible to link income, work and livelihoods to broader challenges and actually deliver on the big challenges of the day, like climate and biodiversity action? So this afternoon, we are going to talk over these issues. We have two panels. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Andrew Percy, who's going to introduce the first one, and the panelists who have agreed to speak. But I think the most important point we have to think about is how do we conceive of this new kind of economy? How will we actually bring it into being? And at the moment, whilst there's a lot of talk about it, there's very, very little that's concrete about what we might actually do. So at this point, welcome again. And I'm going to hand over to Andrew on the first panel. Andrew, are you there?
Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to everybody who has joined us as attendees. I'm also very happy to introduce the panelists on this first session. They will be Stephen Machin, Ruth Yeoman, and Anand Menon, who will join us to share thoughts on what the exiting from this crisis will mean for work, for workers, and in this session particularly how, if the crisis will lead to any sort of changed relationship between the citizen and the state. I am the director of the Social Prosperity Network at the IGP, and the work that we do mostly is on 21st century social security systems and universal basic services. So after we've heard from each of the panelists, we'll move on to a more open discussion. And I would encourage you to submit your questions as we go along. Any questions that are clarifying questions for the speaker that you are listening to at the time, we will address at the end of that particular contribution. And more general questions we will move on to in the second half of this session. So you should find a little Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom window. You may be familiar with all of this already, having been on lots of webinars recently. But please use that and submit your questions. We will see them centrally. So first, if we could hear from Stephen Machin. Stephen is Director of the Centre of Economic Performance and a Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. His current research interests include labour market inequality, the economics of education, and the economics of crime.
Okay, so I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for giving me the opportunity to talk at this event. It looks like a very interesting event, and as Henrietta's introduction suggested, obviously on the absolutely vital issue that's facing the country and the world right now. So I was asked to give a kind of opening remarks about the labour market post-COVID. And so I want to structure my presentation in two ways. First, to give a kind of discussion about what's happening, and then to actually talk explicitly about policy. So I've therefore titled the talk about labour market policy as well. So just to reiterate, I'm going to talk about two issues. One, what's going on, and then about potential policies. Explicitly about the labour market. So to begin with, it's very clear from many in many dimensions the labour market has already taken a big hit, and it's going to continue to take a big hit from the lockdown that's occurred in response to COVID. Most firms, obviously with some notable exceptions, but most firms have experienced negative demand shocks, and there's been significant layoffs already, and a significant furloughing of work, where people are being kept on, sometimes doing stuff and sometimes not necessarily doing very much, but being paid by the job retention scheme. It's also true that the self-employed are getting a lot less work and are facing very significant income losses in terms of their livelihood. I think one of the key things about the situation is that when we start thinking about the way in which transitions back to work are going to occur, and I think there's going to be very significant variations in terms of who might just go back to their job, and it's not very different as compared to people who are going to face future job loss and people who are going to be reallocated across sectors. And these patterns of going back to work are going to likely be very uneven, even within firms. Certainly within sectors, certainly across sectors. And this is likely to make the patterns of labour market inequality that can arise rather different and probably more marked than in previous recessions. So of course we can think that we know some stuff from previous research about what happens in recessions, but there are some things this time that are very different, including the obvious, very discrete lockdown that occurred immediately. What normally happens in recessions is, the weaker firms and people in weaker job positions tend to get laid off first or get shut down. And it's a much smoother process as we go, rather than this complete discrete shutdown that we've had this time. So I would argue that both the discrete shutdown and the consequences of what's going to happen as and when people go back to work would mean that an immediate and a longer-term policy response needs to be thought of here. It needs to be joined up in the sense of thinking not just about what's happening now. We need to be thinking about longer-term policy outcomes as well. Okay, why might we think that inequalities have gone up? Well, there's various very clear measures we've got already in data, and from very valuable surveys that people have been doing before many of the regular data sources come out. They come out from the Office of National Statistics and elsewhere, obviously with a lag. And so people have been undertaking surveys. For example, we've got DWP seeing 2.9 million new individual declarations for universal credit. It's a huge number. 1 in 4, at least 1 in 4, probably a little higher than 1 in 4 workers are furloughed. That's about 8.4 million employees in 1 million firms who've claimed £15 billion to the government's so far. The worst, there is big significant variations. The worst hit employees in terms of jobs or earning losses are the low paid and women workers. Probably the worst hit amongst every single group are probably self-employed, especially those initially on low incomes, and in particular solo self-employed individuals. That's the self-employed who don't have any workers, and not the entrepreneurs, but the people who are just working by themselves in a self-employed position, taking particularly big income so far. It's also true that consumer spending has been falling, but this is again very much not in a uniform way across different products and services. It's not uniform across different demographic groups. And actually, some people whose spending are falling are actually richer individuals who are actually saving more money now. And so, of course, this means that earnings inequality, income inequality, and wealth inequality are rising actually quite rapidly in some contexts as well. The forced saving such that you can't consume. If you've already got a high income, then you're actually getting quite a lot richer as time progresses. If there's various goods and services that you usually consume that you don't, then obviously you're involved in a kind of forced saving. Therefore, earnings inequality through the labour market, overall income inequalities in households and families, and wealth inequalities. And again, in a rather different way to which we've seen trends over the last 40 years when inequality has been rising. This is again showing different in some dimensions. It's showing different. Okay, so I also said I would like to think about the longer run consequences here, and not just thinking about a snapshot right now. And the dynamics of how people are going to go back to work is absolutely vital to this. So I think we can think there's going to be quite a lot of variation or heterogeneity across different sorts of workers and different sorts of firms who are doing different kinds of things. So you might think that many people will be going back once the social distancing measures end, or if and when the social distancing measures end. But it's also true that some sectors are going to face long-term or even permanent disruption. Workers will probably go back part-time, short-time working and operations. Others might not return at all and may end up being laid off either because there's no demand for their jobs, or via mass layoffs because their firm shuts down because there's no demand for their products. So of course these groups will either have to reallocate into different industries or occupations, hopefully if their skills are to some degree transferable, or else face a spell of joblessness. So this is absolutely vital for the policy response that we're going to be thinking about. And then at the same time, there's a reasonably large fraction, probably of high-skilled workers who've already been able to telework fine during the crisis, albeit subject to some constraints. But they're going to go back to business pretty much more or less as usual, and certainly in terms of when things settle down. And of course, from what we know about the people who've been more affected, this is the higher income, higher skill occupation individuals in the labour market. So all of this has scope to create a kind of much more unequal hierarchy of work as we go out of the crisis. And the dynamics that the different groups are on is going to be absolutely crucial to understanding how we can provide a kind of policy response to that. It's also true that because of who the individuals are who've been more affected in terms of earnings losses and job losses are lower income people, that it's already exacerbating already existing inequalities in work. So from the past, we certainly know from research that when people face unemployment spells, spells out of work, especially those of longer duration, these may well have potentially longer-term scarring effects for both individual earnings in the future and for job prospects, especially for people who might be ending up on a kind of trajectory that may be heading towards some lengthy spell, long-term spell of unemployment. Again, I think we really need to think about this very, very carefully when thinking about policy in terms of coming out of the lockdown. Okay, so I would argue that we need to be already thinking about these policies, how we might define policies to counter labour market inequalities, and also limit the scope for long-run scars to occur. So it's obvious that the short-run priority has to be to protect those who are most immediately vulnerable in the labour market. But we also have to be careful to make sure there's an aim to prevent long-term scarring and to think of how to better transition the unemployed into work. When people do lose their job or they get involved by a mass layoff, then we really do need to be thinking about how we can transition people back into work in an efficient manner. There are opportunities, of course, here. So investments required to meet net zero are important. And so we may well be able to restructure some of the new jobs available in that kind of way that can create employment opportunities even in the short term. So to be a bit more concrete about actual policies that I think are potentially important and should certainly be being considered. When we think about phasing down and perhaps restructuring of furlough measures, they've already been restructured in both in terms of extension and thoughts about when employers should be starting to contribute more, relative to the 80% that they're being paid now. But the absolutely vital thing, I think, the absolutely vital aim should be make sure that long-term unemployment doesn't return. We really do not want to be returning to what happened in the early 1980s. Long-term unemployment had massive effects on individuals and communities and on society in general. It's not just the economic costs, the psychological costs, the mental health costs of long-term unemployment. We really need to make sure that these huge costs are not coming back as a consequence of this crisis. So I think I've already alluded to this a little bit, but I think part-time and short-term working are like some very important features of this phasing down and restructuring of the furlough for people who will be returning to their positions. I think we have to think very carefully about the point about whether people are going to be on a trajectory that's leading them towards long-term unemployment. 12 months being the conventional definition that people think of. In the US, when benefits tend to get exhausted, it's 6 months. We really need to be thinking about what happens to those people who are mapped on a trajectory in that direction. It seems to me that we should be offering job guarantees to people who are in that kind of position, with employment being guaranteed in potential jobs. It's also true there's an opportunity from the sustainability point of view here that job guarantees in net zero sustainable jobs could actually be a very valuable thing. I think we need to be thinking both in terms of, not in terms of the fact that there's an inequality of pay, but there's also been a big inequality in terms of health risk associated with what's going on. And I think we should be thinking about doing something for key workers. It's not just sufficient to pay them more, but I think we should be definitely thinking about paying key workers. Something like at least the voluntary living wage, which of course is higher than the national living wage. Currently £10.75 per hour in London and £9.30. It seems that employers with appropriate government assistance could be required to adopt these kind of pay and benefit parity policies, like the voluntary living wage. And that just seems to me to be an absolute no-brainer that we need to be thinking about, given the service that's been done by some of these people. If we think then about the people who would be moving across sectors, or perhaps moving across occupations, and what their skill levels are, and whether they have general skills that could be reutilized in different sectors or occupations, or whether they don't. There's clearly going to be some people who don't, probably a large fraction who don't. And so I think we need to think about how reskilling and training the workforce, something we've been very bad on in this country for decades, at least. Certainly compared to countries like Germany, Switzerland, Austria, we have much, much better means of reintegrating people into work when they lose their jobs. I think we really need to be tackling this head on now, rather than just giving various kind of weak policy responses, saying we just need to improve vocational education and then nothing really being done. This really needs to be tackled very seriously. The second reason why it really needs to be tackled very seriously is a very significant bias in terms of tax credits and the like that the government offers to firms, very much skewed towards physical capital and indeed R&D capital and away from human capital. These are all inputs into the production process: R&D, physical capital, machines, and workers. And yet, there's very little in the way of any incentives in the tax system in the form of human capital tax credits, for example. And I think we really need to be thinking about how we can design policies like that. They do operate in other countries, and they operate quite well, especially when people are losing their jobs to reposition them to gain work in a different sector. One thing we do have is the apprenticeship levy, which is rather limited, which is another employer subsidy. I don't see any reason why we can't think about this more broadly in terms of perhaps a lifelong learning levy, especially as we need to restructure work once furlough employment subsidies phase down. The other point is back to the vocational side of things, and this is the local dimension. We know there's very poor skill supply in some parts of the country, and we know that therefore employers won't go there and locate in certain places because there is no skill sets of workers that they could supply workers they can draw on. We need to get this much more balanced. Part of it, I think, is better information for researchers to say something about these wedges between supply and demand in certain locations, and definitely in certain spatial areas. But also to think about how we can restructure vocational dimensions in the vocational arena much better to deliver higher productivity in the workplace. So the other point I would say is that I stressed before, but it seems that earnings, income, and wealth inequality are rising. It seems to me that one way of generating extra funds that was very plausible here is by a progressive wealth tax. I already said that the wealthy are getting wealthier because of the forced savings that's going on right now. One possibility which I think should be considered very seriously is to think about a one-off progressive wealth tax assessed on, for example, the net worth of the top 1% of the richest individuals. This seems quite important when we might be thinking about where we can fund some of these kinds of policies. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. There's a list of references here if anybody's interested in relevant work that's been done. I would make one last point as well. I was asked to talk about the labour market and jobs in particular. This is one last point on which to end, which is the next cohort of people who are going to be entering the labour market are very important here as well. And they're coming into something which is pretty unprecedented. People who are leaving school now, or who are even leaving university now, are going to be graduating into one of the biggest recessions people have ever graduated. We know from research this can have long-lasting effects on their livelihoods and jobs in the future. I think we shouldn't lose sight of this group when we only talk about the labour market as well.
I think that's a really good point, Stephen.
So both education and labour market inequality combine. We know the two twin drivers of low social mobility are education, higher education inequality, and higher income inequality. And if these two combine, then the social mobility picture is not going to be looking very promising in the future. And I think we need to make sure we take this opportunity this time round, make sure that doesn't happen.
Right.
Thank you.
No, well, thank you very much, and great introduction to the subject. Certainly, you take the recommendations you've put forward there. We're talking about a much more active role for government than was taken in previous downturns of this kind. I don't see any clarifying questions at this point. So, Ruth, if you are ready, I will ask you to go next. Ruth Yeoman is a fellow of Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. She's an expert in applying the ethics and practices of meaningfulness and mutuality to organizations and systems. She's worked with local governments, financial mutuals, and building societies, and was the lead consultant on the Cabinet Office 2015 Mutuals in Health initiative. Ruth, are you there, and can we hear you?
Yes.
Oh, hi.
Yes,
Great.
you can hear me.
Oh, yeah, and I can see you. Great. I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm going to share my screen now. So thank you very much, Andrew, for inviting me onto this panel, and for hosting this event. So the perspective that I bring to this topic is as a political theorist and also a business ethicist. So you'll get something which is quite normative and maybe even a bit speculative. So for me, the questions that I think we need to ask here are: what does better work look like? How should we reform our economies? What policies would this imply? And how should these policies reflect the changing conditions of work that we're observing during COVID-19? And also, very importantly, the need to repair the social contract between citizens and the state. by the middle of June, we're going to know whether the confusions. But in the meantime, the government's actions throw up a number of worries related to the relationship between citizens and the state. In a properly functioning social contract, we make the rules to bind us all. We make them so that no person is overly burdened or overly advantaged. And by obeying the rules, we signal to each other that we care about each other, as well as caring about those things that matter to us all in common. So seeing others taken advantage makes people feel that their efforts are futile. Start from the slide here, which is about our obligations to workers. So one of the arguments here is that because people are putting themselves in harm's way for our sake, and they're doing work that exposes them to risks beyond the expectations of their employment contract, then they're entitled to have a say in the cultural conditions of their work. And the contributions that people make to social cooperation should be worthy of their efforts. They should provide them with goods such as autonomy and dignity, and they should be emotionally engaging. To develop their capabilities, most people need organisational belonging, a belonging that enables them to contribute in ways that give them a sense of meaning and purpose. And people are interested in the meaning of their work and the purposes driving the organisations they belong to. And one of the problems with diminished job quality is the harms that arise from not having anything serious to do that actually matters. So what does better work look like? The International Labour Organization's definition of decent work concentrates on productive work, material conditions, and worker voice. Quality of work definitions add to this features such as autonomy and civic principles, well-being, freedom, dignity, and the like. Drawing upon meaningfulness as a moral value, I've defined meaningful work as activities structured by autonomy, freedom, and dignity, directed towards taking care of things of independent value and moral significance, and experienced as emotionally engaging and worthwhile. So even before the pandemic, the quality of work was in decline. And using the work and employment relations of work on that data set has examined the diminished job control over time. Individual task discretion is related to how much say an individual has over how hard they work, deciding what tasks they are to do, how the tasks are to be done, and the quality standards to which they work. And organizational participation is related to the ability to influence workplace decisions, including perceived effective influence. And individual task discretion has reduced from 1992 to 2012. So too has the perceived effective influence over workplace decisions. So we already had a problem. To challenge our imaginations regarding how work should be organised, there are a number of suggestive studies proposing that economists should take greater account of our need for meaning as a motivational drive. And meaning has been identified as a route to well-being. Carlson and colleagues proposed elements of meaning that could be incorporated into argue that meaningful work is an important consideration for labour economics, including work meaning as being motivational and predicting absenteeism, skills training and retirement intentions. And they find that extrinsic factors such as income are relatively unimportant for explaining variations in work meaningfulness. So we really do have a lot of resources that we can draw upon to think about how to create better work. Stefan and colleagues list 18 existing quality of work instruments, and the German Gute Arbeit, which has been running since 2005, incorporates subjective dimensions of meaningful work, such as, do you feel you make an important contribution to society through your work? And do you have the impression you make an important contribution to your company through your work? And there's a lot more. We have the 2004 information and consultation legislation that could underpin worker voice. There's a whole variety of data sets, policy reports that can help us to connect to reform of corporations. And of course, we have strong motivating reasons derived from the need for a green economy transition and automation. Economies with better work in mind. We need some values and principles to guide economic institutions, which are rooted in ethical as well as an economic work. And if we want an organisation of work to help us repair the relationship between citizens and the state, then I think we need to prioritise the quality of work, including the civic principles embodied in the content of work, as well as the institutions that support such work. And we also need to prioritise, I think, the associational life of the social and productive economy. And one example proposal is Paul Hirst's work on associative democracy, in which society is orchestrated by voluntary and democratically self-governing associations. So Paul Hirst developed this in the 1990s, but I think this proposal remains relevant and could be adapted to our present needs. And there are also many options for the design values and principles which would support such an associational democracy. And for my own part, I've recently considered the interaction between meaningfulness and mutuality. So just to give you a quick trot through associative democracy, it yields aims, values, principles and practices. With respect to aims, associative democracy is concerned both with authority within organisations and with decentralised and cooperative governance of the economy as a whole. Values for an associational ethics. And here I think Paul Hirst's proposal needs amending in the light of COVID-19 to include, for example, meaning and an ethic of care. Principles of organisation. So democracy acts as a communication mechanism, provides a pathway for building knowledge and innovation. And economic practices of cooperation and coordination. And we're increasingly becoming familiar with these practices as organisations mobilise together to address climate heating. So work is changing fast and public policy is having to catch up. COVID-19 teaches us that work is not just a trend. It also teaches us that people want to do meaningful work in purposeful organisations. Now, before the pandemic, there was much attention upon a universal basic income to address anxieties arising from automation. Finland's recent UBI experiment showed strong well-being benefits, although only a small employment impact. So a UBI is probably not enough on its own. We need a public policy ecosystem that targets work design and incorporates values into the production of the goods and services that we all need. And this public policy ecosystem could include elements of the Good Work Index, entitlements to human capability development and organisational belonging, a framework for deliberative and representative worker voice, a diversity of ownership forms within an associative economic democracy, and perhaps also a UBI. And by the way, I don't think we should wait for the government to do this policy work for us. I think we should find other levels of society at which to try this out. So, for example, voluntary corporate codes, covenants for sectors and supply chains, and constitutions at a city level. Now, all of this begs many additional questions. If we're going to be looking on the left-hand side at these factors of complexity, systemic risk, interdependence, sustainability, meaning and purpose, inequalities and legitimacy, then on the other side, there's a whole raft of questions related to, well, what value is indeed worth creating? What kind of associational life do we need? Who are those who are going to have a share in decision making? And how do we give these constructive voice? How do we change behaviours? How do we both cooperate and compete at the same time? How do we evaluate inputs and outcomes? And most importantly, how do we design and make the change?
Thank you very much for that, Ruth. You're certainly extending the ambition of, as you would call it, a public policy ecosystem into an even more ambitious desire to come into a better work environment post-COVID. So thank you very much for that introduction to that, to ideas about how that can be done. What I think the question that will kind of rise out of that is also, and this is maybe something that Anand can help us with, is any of this on the political agenda of any of the people at the moment? Although I appreciate Ruth's comment that this does not have to rely on government centrally, that we can start, and I think many people have, either at local government or at organizational levels, to adopt those kinds of principles. But what's the state of play at a national level, Anand, as you see it, in terms of the willingness of any of the major political parties, either here or in Europe, to engage in something that is not just a return to how it was, but maybe something different?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me. To start with the obvious, we're living through unique times. I'd point you towards the FT's editorial on the 3rd of April, which talks about the need for a social contract that benefits everyone. And I think despite what Ruth says, actually what government does holds the key to all of this, in the sense, if we're going to react to this crisis, it's going to have to be ultimately through central government. And so I suppose my argument in a nutshell is that the politics really matters. And here, whilst we spell out these sort of ambitious schemes to remake our economy, remember, we've been there before. I remember straight after the Brexit referendum in 2016, the Economist remarkably discovered the fact that globalization generates losers as well as winners, much to its surprise. And despite the fact that many people started writing in that vein, nothing much at all has been done. So just because we realize there's a problem doesn't mean politics will act on it. And I'm going to try and do three things. Talk very, very briefly about why the pandemic means that we're now talking about things like inequality more, what we might do about it, though I'll leave that largely up to the economists, and what the political constraints on doing this might be and how they might be overcome. If I get time at the end, I'll briefly mention what the Labour Party could be doing, if I get time in the 15 minutes. One of the things that FT editorial points out is that the sacrifice made has not been collective, and in many ways the impact of the pandemic has reinforced existing inequalities, whether you're talking about health, where the greatest impact has been partly on ethnic minorities, but also on less well-off communities. According to the ONS data, if you take age and population into account, the COVID-19 death rate is about twice as high in the most deprived areas of England and Wales as in the least deprived, but also in terms of economic impact. So Those under 25 are 2.5 times more likely to work in sectors such as hospitality and non-food retail that are closed entirely. Those lowest workers, the lowest earning 10% of workers, were 7 times as likely as the highest earners to work in sectors that have closed. And women are 1/3 more likely to work in sectors that have been shut down. There's also, and I don't think we talk about this enough, a strong geographical element to this. Again, post-referendum, we've kind of rediscovered geography a little bit, but work by the Centre for Cities points out that 40% of workers can work from home in London and Edinburgh, and the equivalent figures for Barnsley and Stoke is 20%. And while 90% of the self-employed in Barnsley are engaged in low-paid work, the equivalent for Cambridge is only 58%. So the crisis is heightening pre-existing divisions. And, you know, none of this is rocket science. I mean, the fact of the matter is we shouldn't have needed a pandemic to come to the conclusion that precarious work is, well, precarious, or that some groups do far less well than others for structural reasons owing to the workings of our economy. You know, think back to what the Social Mobility Commission said last year, that half of working age adults think that where you end up is determined mainly by your background. This was morally wrong and economic damaging even before the COVID pandemic, but one of the things about the pandemic is it has stretched that Overton window still further. And, you know, to go back to that FT editorial, it's striking to find that that paper was talking about giving government a greater role in the economy, seeing public services as investments, not liabilities, making labour markets less insecure, and having redistribution back on the agenda, including things like a basic income and wealth taxes. And I think, you know, wealth is key to this. You should all listen. I mean, he might talk about it in the next panel, but Jonathan Portes was very persuasive in talking, for instance, about the need to reband council taxes when he was on the Today programme recently. Actually, I should add to that we could overhaul a tax system that is riddled with perverse incentives while we're about it. But the point is, and I suppose this is the bottom line of what I want to say to you all, is however compelling the economic or even the normative case, it's the political case that matters if something has to be done. I mean, after all, a lot of economists realised pre-2010 that austerity probably isn't the best way to boost the UK economy after a financial crisis. And yet, now, there are reasons to believe that this time will be different. And part of that is the sequencing. This comes after a financial crisis. And given the experience of the financial crisis, it's probably harder to continue with the old model as if nothing had changed, because we tried that before and it didn't work out very well. We'll come out of this crisis with the state owning, or at least having a large stake in much of the economy, so that might be quite hard to roll back. And of course, the Conservatives have undermined, at least up to now, all the arguments they spent that period between 2010 and 2017 making about fiscal prudence and the magic money tree. So it might be that the exceptional measures the lockdown has necessitated will be harder to unravel, and it might be that because of that, we approach post-pandemic economics in a fundamentally different way. I'm not wholly convinced. I do think there are a lot of commentators around now who are confusing should with will. So they're writing that, you know, the economy will function in a different way after COVID, where actually what they mean is should. And to think about this, I think it's worth thinking about the nature of our governing party and the difficult political choices that the Conservatives face. The Conservative Party in government now is very different to any Conservative Party in government before. In 2019, they had a lead amongst working class voters of 21 points. Those red wall MPs are crucial to its re-election strategy, and those red wall seats, of course, are very different to normal Conservative seats in terms of things like median income, concentration of manufacturing, etc. So this in itself might change the perspective of a Conservative government when it comes to the economy, though the counterpoint is you shouldn't assume that just because an MP represents a northern manufacturing seat that their interest will be in economic policy will be aligned with those of their constituents necessarily. There are plenty of headbanging Brexiters who wanted a no-deal Brexit who represent northern seats. And one of the interesting things from the data is the difference between what Tory MPs think and what many of their voters think. So to take one example, around a quarter of all voters, 28%, disagree with the statement that government should redistribute from the better off to the worse off. And only 8% of voters who switched from Labour to Tory in 2019 disagree with this principle. However, when we asked MPs in January and February this same question, we found that 63% of Conservative MPs disagreed with this principle. So there's a gulf in terms of economic thinking between MPs and their constituents. And for a similar and nicely symmetrical finding, in our poll of MPs in January, 82% of Conservative MPs disagreed with the statement that there is one law for the rich and one for the poor. Whereas amongst people who switched from voting Labour in 2017 to Tory in 2019, a very satisfying 82% agreed with the proposition that there is one law for the rich and one for the poor. So in some senses, the economic thinking of Conservative MPs is at odds with the thinking of their new voters who they gained courtesy largely of their Brexit policy at the election. And it's worth just remembering that mainstream Conservative thinking hasn't disappeared. Sajid Javid recently did a long interview with Beth Rigby, and amongst the statements he made were the following gems. Pay rises for nurses must be sustainable. Many things will change as a result of this crisis. One thing that won't is the need for a free enterprise, low tax economy, because this is the best economic model. And finally, you can only spend what you've got. So there is still a strand of thinking within the governing party, and it is quite strong on the backbenchers that just because we've had this pandemic and just because of the impact of this pandemic doesn't mean we need to upend the economic thinking of the last 40 years. And I think it is too easy to simply assume that even among the public that this crisis will lead to a leftward shift, as many people assumed back in 2008. So Ipsos Mori in April asked about people's concerns about poverty and inequality, and only 12% of respondents said that poverty and inequality was one of the most important issues facing the country. And this was down from 19% in February. So despite the pandemic crisis worsening, the numbers of people who saw this as a major issue had declined. And actually some interesting work by Liam Stanley at Sperry at the University of Sheffield finds that whilst the majority of people between 2010 and 2015 felt affected by austerity, and a majority of people felt that the measures taken under austerity were unfair, throughout that period, a majority also thought that austerity was necessary. So it's not necessarily the case that even if people think that something is unfair, they will think that something needs to be done about it. And I think the key, and this is my bottom line, I suppose, to those economists who are thinking about what steps we should take to fix the economy coming out of this, is, as with the financial crisis, is to spell out a compelling narrative. I cannot exaggerate the degree to which the notion of fixing the roof while the sun was shining was a powerful political slogan. And just because something might seem economically self-evident or even morally self-evident does not mean that politics will act on it. And that means that actually part of the challenge is to make it obviously seem in the self-interest of the governing party to act on the economic issues that we've been talking about in this panel. There's been a very good recent book by the people who carry out the British election study, and they point out 3 ways in which shocks like the virus might affect people when it comes to vote switching. The first is perceptions of competence, the second is the change in salience of issues, and the third is the changes in the social and political image of a party, from all of which you will deduce that this is a golden opportunity for the Labour Party. A focus on competence and on Rishi Sunak's promise to do whatever it takes is an obvious starting point. To make the debate going forward over the next months and years one about the economy rather than on the values issues on which the Conservatives are very confident is a logical starting point for Keir Starmer. And to bang home the message that the Conservatives are out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people, a message that will be helped by the goings on this week, is also, I think, critical. So there is a political battle to be fought. And I think whatever the good thinking that goes on about models of managing our economy and of making it work better for the people who didn't do well out of it beforehand, all of which is very, very necessary, do not lose from sight the fact that ultimately, if things are going to get done, they need to be done by government, and there is a job of persuasion to be done before it gets done. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Interesting and slightly disconcerting. If we're going to need an explicit sort of change in the narrative around this and what you're describing about the disconnect between the current Conservative MPs and their constituents, makes that seem less likely. Do you have anything to comment on this notion that I think is fairly commonly a question, which is, has the government, have our public institutions now broken a dam, broken a barrier because of the spending that they've initiated for this crisis that's going to make future demands for spending much more difficult for them to resist, whether it's climate change in the future or social care or even investing in this jobs market? We need to fix the roof while the sun is shining, money is limited, there are no money trees. Do you get a sense that stuff is no longer has the sort of weight that it used to have?
Well, I'd answer that in three bits. Firstly, I think that's absolutely true when it comes to the specific case of the NHS. Whether it's true of social care, maybe, but I'm not 100% convinced about that. But I think, yes, you'll see the government being quite generous towards the NHS. Secondly, I'm pretty damn convinced that this government isn't going to label whatever it does in economic policy austerity. Doesn't mean they're not going to do something relatively similar, but they'll give it a different name and they'll label it differently, and it'll have to be sold differently. But I don't think they will necessarily go down that same route, which isn't the same as to say that they'll invest heavily in those areas, those people, those bits of society that have been labelled as key workers or essential services during this. On climate specifically, I'm particularly sceptical, I have to say, in the sense that I think that's the next great struggle. Is I think coming out of this, what you will see, and remember I mentioned, I didn't go into it in any detail in my remarks, that actually what the Conservatives did at the last election was create a very coherent values coalition. 82% of people who voted Tory in December of last year were Leave supporters. And because the best way to predict whether you're a Leave or Remain supporter is whether or not you're socially liberal or socially conservative, there is a great social conservative coalition there. And it's in the interest of the Conservatives to mobilise that coalition, not least because Labour is absolutely riven down the middle on social values. And I think climate will be one of the areas in which they choose to do that. And the argument going forward will be, we cannot afford to deal with niceties like, the fact the planet is dying, because actually our priority has to be to get the economy going again. And I suspect we will see quite a lot of that going forward. Expect to hear a lot more of Nigel Lawson over the months to come, would be my guess. No, I'm doing nothing but depress you now.
Yeah. No, exactly. That's lined up. Well, so let me take some of those questions back to Stephen and Ruth. Do you, Stephen? Do you? Again, you've got a policy framework there that you're advocating. Do you get a sense that we are yet at the point that the general public and/or our political bodies are ready to engage in the kinds of changes that we, fairly clearly laid out? It would seem that we're going to need from a work perspective coming out of this, and all of the scarring that we're talking about. There's been broad understanding of the dangers and the stuff that's coming. But if we have a disconnect at the kind of root level, do we need a new story?
I don't know about the government side of things particularly. But what I would say is, I do think there's a greater demand and a greater appetite, because I think people are looking more at actual evidence that's coming out, and it is being transmitted a bit better this time. And I think there is a realization that each time we've come out of recessions, things have just not been done properly. And this is because in some policy areas, this idea that you just tinker about a little bit and do small interventions that end up not really changing very much has become very kind of popular amongst. It's one of the ironies about lots of the behavioural economics work, I think, but actually just doing it on the cheap, just to get a small reaction on the cheap, even if it's cost effective, doesn't work. These things cost money. That's why I was trying to emphasize in my talk about the dynamics of this. And actually, if you're thinking about long run costs, different things like scaling, then actually, if you do actually need to spend quite a lot of money to offset those costs, but it can still be cost effective in doing so. I would also pick up a little bit on Anand, on one of his comments. I mean, granted, it is true that some, indeed many economists, are not very good communicators of their work. But I actually think we need more support from other social science disciplines. If, in your words, Anand, the kind of continued mantra, if you like, that even if economics is right, even if it's morally right, that we end up not communicating it very well to get over to politicians because economists are crap at communicating. I just don't think that's that helpful thing. And sure, that is a reason why it doesn't get passed over. But perhaps other social sciences, we do want to take an interdisciplinary approach. But actually say that if economics is right, and if it's morally right, then we should be trying to get it over in a kind of coalition of voices, rather than separating out the disciplines within the social sciences. And it's failed massively in the past. I think a lot of running economists down because of what happened with the global financial crisis, especially macroeconomists. I do share some of those views myself, but it's not quite the right way to go forward. I don't think. And so I think Anand would definitely want to respond to me. I know, but I actually think there is a demand and an appetite for change this time. At least now. Maybe it will just fade back into the same old thing. That nothing really serious gets done to tackle the inequality, the inherent endemic inequalities that I was pointing out both in education and in economic inequalities and social inequalities more broadly, that lead to poor social mobility levels, which we know have been very bad on in this country. Over time, we've had a persistently low rate of social mobility compared to other countries. I would like to think that continually plugging on and getting the evidence over in a more systematic, better communicated way can help in that.
Would you like me to comment?
Yeah, sure. And then I was just going to add into that, perhaps you can also mention, I mean, I know yesterday that the governor of the Bank of England says that the bank has a duty to British households. That perhaps there's something in that language that's a change as a change in public institutions and their attitudes. Ruth, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Of course, I would not disagree that we need to have our eyes open to the political realities. We are, I think, for me, take a cold, hard look at the resources that we already have, the history that we have in attempts to look at new kinds of work design, both within organizations and maybe even initiatives within sectors and elsewhere. And I think we could look at that history and we can do something within it in order to address what I think are new duty obligations we have towards workers. And I think, therefore, it's really important to think about whether there are alternative avenues for experimenting with that history, for auditing it, for repackaging it, and for bringing it into new kind of scenery, if you like. And I think that looking at sectors and supply chains and cities as social and economic entities, which are part of the state, if you like, but also have some kind of independence from the state, those are very useful points of leverage for trying out some of these ideas and to trying out new ways of recognizing how these obligations and also have resources that we can draw upon to create new initiatives looking at the quality of work and the new kinds of economics that we need.
I think that's a really good point, Ruth. And certainly in the work that we do at the IGP, we've been involved with a number of local governments who are definitely being more experimental than we would expect to see from national government. But to give Anand a chance to respond to what Steve was saying, and let me add in, isn't unemployment a statistic that no politician can effectively ignore, and that we're already talking about estimates at 10% here. At the end of the furlough scheme, we could be seeing that much higher. Is that not actually a sort of salient statistic that cuts through a lot of this, the sort of morals or particular philosophical positions for politicians?
Yes, absolutely. Unemployment is something that I think politicians fear, quite rightly, because it has direct political impacts, particularly if you see sort of unemployment because of closures of industries concentrated in certain areas, in certain regions. That is, politically potentially very damaging. Part of this, of course, again, is about messaging, in the sense that it depends on the degree to which a government can portray unemployment as a unfortunate but inevitable fallout of a pandemic over which we had no control, and the degree to which others can portray it as the entirely avoidable consequence of a series of economic decisions over which the government had control as we came out of the pandemic. I think there's a debate to be had there. Just to go back to what Steve said, I mean, it made me think that ultimately I'm the crap communicator here, in the sense that I hadn't meant to say economists are bad at communicating. What I meant to say was actually the progressive side of politics as a whole has been crap at communicating, and crap since 2008. And this wasn't, I wouldn't go to a NISA seminar and slag off economists anyway, because that would be too scary. But that really, I mean, I think, I was trying to say I value the work that economists do, but someone, and it can be economists, it can be whoever, I mean, needs to be aware of the fact that above and beyond the detail work, there needs to be some messaging, there needs to be a narrative built. And I wasn't for a moment suggesting that economists were uniquely bad at doing this. I just think that, progressive politics needs to be a bit savvier about selling things as a whole. And that's not ultimately the job of economists, though if economists want to step up to the plate and help doing that, then that will be much appreciated.
To pick up on something that I think Ruth was, starting with there, which was this, can we do something in more local, at a more local level? That one of the things that I think COVID has definitely done is highlighted to millions of people across the country the capacity for very hyper local types of services, that mutual aid group in the street. The very local services that have sprung up, and in our work with local councils, they've talked a lot about how this is sort of, welled up, and it's something they're desperately trying to support carrying on past this crisis period. Do you think that is a sort of another avenue in which, through influence on local government? I mean, you mentioned Jonathan talking about reforming, council tax bans and that kind of thing. That there has to be some energy there at a local government level as well, and that perhaps this crisis has fed into that through this kind of heightened awareness that millions of citizens now have about the sort of hierarchy of, there's some, very local services, and then they're part of a slightly larger group and a regional group and a national, and that some of that might feed through into a greater support for local government. Because one of the sort of tragedies I think that we saw post GFC and in the last decade of government is that a lot of austerity was foisted onto local government, and has left national government able to stand relatively clean compared to what's happened at a local level. So before we end this session, and while we've still got a few minutes left, I wanted to ask if either Henrietta or Angus wanted to come in with any particular questions or contributions.
Yeah, I'd like to come in, actually. I don't know what Angus,
Yes.
are we competing, are we?
We are, but you go first, of course.
Well, just to say that I very much enjoyed everybody's contribution, and just following up on some things that Steve was saying, perhaps there is the very corrosive effect of long-term unemployment, but equally there's the next structural transformation of the economy coming. And of course, the crisis has really put some energy behind that, because one of the things that automation allows is that you can turn off the tap and turn it on again when you need it. You don't actually have to furlough it. There's no furloughing of automation. So I think we need to think about where this is going to happen, and exactly as you said, not just in sectors, but actually within firms as well. So there could be the unevenness of what we might be facing in the labour market could be well outside the standard understandings of how labour markets have responded under previous recessions. And one of the things that really concerns me is that although there are a lot of people talking about building back better and all of these kinds of things, there's very, very little evidence that anyone's actually trying to put together an understanding of whether it would make a difference to put massive investment into one area, what would be the spillover effects, what are the skills and training requirements of doing that, and how would we do it? In other words, there's really little evidence, even if narratives are changing, of actual any planning change or any of the thinking of the nuts and bolts that would be required. Angus, I'm ceding the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. So my question touches on something that Steve raised about the bringing up the pay of people who've been doing some of the most vulnerable jobs. And while I can imagine there's enough political support for that at the moment, after a year, will that just have gone into the dark past and we'll have forgotten about whether we should think about those people who do some of the most risky jobs for us at the low end of the pay? Should we not think of a way that we have a more moral approach to this, rather than just say, well, that's market forces, they tell it's the low wage, that's what they get? Are we always going to devolve our moral judgments to market prices? Because as long as we do that, we seem to always have this very exposed sector in society. And if we are to have a different approach, how might we do that? I remember the old pay bargaining in the civil service committees. I can't remember what they're called, reward or something committees, where people would think about risks and so on top of just comparators to other industries. And so maybe there's a way of looking at people who do take on these roles, which have really come into our consciousness, that this can last more than what I fear would just be 1 year or maybe 2 years, if it's just bringing them up in line with current wage guidelines. So the question is, how might that longer term approach perhaps work?
Okay, so I take those two then?
Yeah.
At least start with. Okay, let me go Angus first. I'll go in reverse order. I mean, you have to remember these groups of workers we're talking about, the key workers in the public sector and other key workers, like care home workers, care assistants. They've been losing out for a long time, and so as inequality's been going up, they've been losing out for a long time. Minimum wage increasing since it came in has been a good thing, but it doesn't seem to have had any damaging effect certainly in terms of jobs, even though it's been ramped up to quite a high level by now. The evidence seems to suggest that it's not been bad for jobs. That's not the marginal adjustment that firms go for when they want to react to the wage cost shock of the minimum wage going up. They seem to do something else, and they don't get forced out of business. They don't lay off workers. They are able to absorb those costs. I was actually suggesting in the short term, with the help of government, in a similar vein to the policies, the active labour market policies that they've been engaging in so far. Incidentally, I would say that for all intents and purposes, the job retention scheme is a job guarantee scheme. People are being guaranteed work now already with the furloughing scheme, and so as that gets phased down, it's not that controversial thing to think to have a job guarantee provided by the state for people who are on a trajectory towards long-term unemployment. On Henrietta's question, of course this is important, and I think you can kind of think that there's always been these raging debates about automation and new technologies being bad for jobs. Yet, we've seen over the centuries that actually that isn't really what happens when new forms of technology come in. What happens is some jobs go and new jobs get created, and you get a changing mix. Of course, this is something that's happening in the over discussion about AI and robotics. That's been very prevalent right now. My view would be, I think that that would still be much the same as what's going on. I do think the lockdown and the measures that have come in actually add some extra things into this. So, of course, social distancing means that human contact obviously is less minimal. So it's more minimal. It's more likely to happen. And so, of course, if it's a robot instead of a person, you don't really have those social distancing concerns. And so you might think there could be an additional wave to substitute away from workers towards machines in response to measures like that if they're going to persist as well. So I think we need to keep our eye on the ball about this, especially thinking about how we design human capital investment policies. And so that discussion about making sure that the current set of workers in the labour market, or who are potentially in the labour market, have the right skills to be able to work with new technologies is vital. It's even more vital, perhaps, to make sure the next generation coming through the education system now have the requisite skills to work with the new technologies of the future. And I think this design of education policies alongside labour market policies needs to be taken much more seriously. They're not independent. And they have to be pulled together, I think, in terms of it's challenging and hard, but not difficult necessarily to be able to do that. I think people need to take a broader view of the way they think about economic and social policies.
Steve, can I just come back to you quickly on the wage cost effect and rises in minimum wage, because I agree that we haven't seen perhaps anticipated fall-offs in employment as that has risen. But one of the things we have seen is that those changes affect local government budgets very strongly because they carry the social care burden. So do you want to comment a little bit on the interaction there between those?
Yeah, I mean, the huge pressure on care homes is not because of the minimum wage going up. It's because of the local authority funding, which comes back to central government. I mean, I've done quite a lot of research on care assistance in respect to the minimum wage. That's the problem, and the fact they are unable to put their prices up at the same time as you get a wage cost, and government and local government doesn't fund that. Not because of local government, because of the central government not giving enough money to local authorities for care services. I mean, the mindset really needs to change on this. And this isn't really an economic argument, because the economics isn't bad on that. I mean, these care homes are staying in business mostly, but they're operating with tiny profit margins because they're not able to raise their prices in response to a minimum wage cost shock. And I mean, the prices is not necessarily being paid by people who putting their parents or whoever into care homes. It's being borne by the local authority residents. And the local authority is the one which should be funding that, but it can't because it isn't being given enough money from central government. And so the vicious circle just goes round and round and round. I mean, the Low Pay Commission has emphasised this in its reports every year, at least for the last 10 years, that something needs to be done about that. And maybe this could be a feature of the crisis when people have seen what's going on in care homes. Actually something properly was get done.
Anand, do you want to say something?
Well, I mean, I suppose a couple of things. One, because I can't go the whole hour and a half without mentioning it, it's worth bearing in mind that one of the first things that the government's going to do in the way of an economic policy is to significantly reduce our trade with our largest trading partner, which is going to have all sorts of spillover effects on the economy. And it's an interesting insight into the thinking of the government that maybe economic recovery isn't first. And it's still a very political government, this. I mean, in economic terms, this just simply makes no sense whatsoever to be doing this when you can delay it for 2 years at relatively little cost, I would have thought. The second thing is just sort of, I don't know the answer to Angus's question, but I would foresee a very interesting debate going to happen about what is and is not a key worker in the period going forward. We're having some very interesting chats about that, in the context of quarantine fruit pickers are key workers. whether in the context of wage rates, Amazon delivery people are as key as social care workers or as key as bus drivers or tube drivers. There are an awful lot of people who have kept working through this in conditions that were just dangerous. If the government guidelines on how we're meant to be behaving are to be believed, and how that debate goes afterwards, and part of it will depend on how the debate is couched. I mean, we've seen in the case of schools how an overly aggressive tone by unions to start off with actually damaged their cause, and I've got profound faith in the ability of the RMT to make the same mistake that the teaching unions made. But I suspect we're going to get a lot of, that will be the first phase of this conversation, won't it? It'll be who is really key, who isn't key. And I think, as I said, the NHS is probably fairly safe, but above and beyond that, it's all up for grabs as far as I can see.
Before I let you go, and I'm going to just cover, because this has sort of come up a little bit, questions around the job guarantee that are in the thread here, and also sometimes the job guarantee linked with some form of, whether we call it looser monetary policy or all the way to novel monetary policy. Just a quick thing from you, Anand and Steve. Anand first, do you see a hope in hell of any kind of employment guarantee, even if that is perhaps limited to particular sectors or regions that might push employment into greening, retrofits, that kind of activity? And then after you, perhaps Steve can comment on whether he sees any relationship between the job guarantee and monetary policy.
It's not inconceivable, and it's not inconceivable, I think, on a regional basis as part of the levelling up agenda rather than anything else. I could see that happening, but all the talk at the moment out of the Treasury is that the Chancellor is regretting saying August and wishing he'd said July for when businesses have to start paying a proportion of their employees' salaries. So I think the push at the moment is in a very different direction. So if you force me to say yes or no, I'd say no, but I'd say it's not wholly inconceivable, but I think they'd have to try and fit it into that regional agenda rather than a national one.
Steve, anything about how you see an employment guarantee? Is that something part of a larger package that might include sort of novel monetary treatments to create the money to fund the employment guarantee, or is that?
I don't think so. I think it's the argument about the massive economic and social costs of long-term unemployment, and this is a policy that can be used to fix that. So, in a sense, if you want to think about monetary policy having a potential role to affect unemployment, perhaps you could put it like that. But refinancing is not the. I would like to be persuaded of evidence that the MMT route about it's actually aggregate demand from consumption, which will generate the financing for the job guarantee. I don't think that's right. That's why I spoke about the wealth tax at the end. That would generate some money that could be used for this. It's not. It's the debts and deficits don't matter argument can only go up to a certain point. I think on these kinds of things. I think it is feasible. I actually think we know from just before at the end of a Labour government, the Future Jobs Fund, which was a training program for young people, was a job guarantee, and it seemed to be cost effective. It was shut down instantly by the Conservative government when they. We have evidence from the Future Jobs Fund. It seems to be a policy that works. And it seems to be that actually grabbing this and thinking about it in conjunction with the sustainability type ideas would be a really sensible, probably cost-effective way to go. Because, as I said, the economic, social, psychological, and social costs of long-term unemployment are pretty high. Not just for the people themselves, their families, and the communities they live in. And it actually is a reasonably cost-effective way, I think, of thinking about a policy that could stop the truly awful experience of long-term unemployment affecting people and communities.
Thank you. Yeah, so it seems like, at least on this panel, we're of a mind that we need to go in a different direction, and that we do need some level of different relationship, a more active role for government, local and national, to help recover from this. But perhaps we've got some work to do in making sure that is what happens outside of this seminar. and this workshop. So, but appreciate all of, thank you to Ruth and Steve and Anand for your contribution to this. I hope if you have a chance, you'll be able to stay on and be part of the second panel. As we move on now to George, are you available and ready? And
yes, hello.
Hi.
Very much, Andrew. That was a great discussion by Ruth, Steve, and Anand. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is George Melios. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Global Prosperity at UCL, and I'm delighted to welcome you all at today's second panel on post-COVID jobs and better work. So, following the great discussion that we've just heard, this one will focus on labor markets and the much-needed recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. We were thinking about focusing the discussion on three key concepts. The first one is how we should reform our economies and how we should bring people back to employment or something close to full employment despite the major social and political and economic challenges. What are the active labor markets that we should pursue? And lastly, whether we've learned something from the functionalities and dysfunctionalities of labor markets through working from home. For this panel, I'm honored to discuss these topics with three distinguished speakers, which I will name in the order that they will speak. First one will be Jonathan Portes, who's an economics professor and public policy at King's College London and a senior fellow at the Economic and Social Research Council UK and a Changing Europe initiative. His research focuses on immigration, labor mobility within European Union and outside, and the economic implications of Brexit. So this will be followed by Geoff Tily, who is a senior economist at the Trades Union Congress and a former macroeconomic advisor at Her Majesty Treasury. And his research focuses on economic policy, labor markets, and the global economy. And the last speaker for this session will be Laura Gardiner, who's the research director at Resolution Foundation. And before that, she was a senior researcher at the Center for Economic and Social Inclusion. And her work is focused on labor markets, taxation, and social mobility. There's a Twitter handle for this and the previous panel and today's workshop that everyone can follow. And there will be a discussion following this panel. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. A very interesting first panel discussion. I will try not to duplicate too much what has already been said, in particular by Steve, much of which, of course, I agreed with. I think one thing that has been remarkably striking for me in the crisis so far has been the unanimity among economists and policymakers, including lots of people who disagreed with each other very violently in the past over austerity and other previous controversies. From the beginning of the crisis, I think economists have been pretty united that we should not be worrying about the sharp fall in GDP that resulted from the restrictions or indeed from individuals' own decisions, because those are necessary to suppress the virus and to allow recovery. And nor should we be worried about the economic consequences of that fall in GDP in terms of very large increases in government deficits. Instead, what we ought to be worried about is permanent damage to the labor market and the economy, usually referred to as scarring, a term which seems to have replaced the term hysteresis, which was the one that was in vogue when I learned economics. But scarring, it seems to be now. So the term scarring has appeared 32 times in the FT since the crisis began. Previously, it hardly appeared at all in the economic sense. But I think what I wanted to explain was that scarring is a bit of a catch-all term, and it refers to a number of quite different ways in which transitory economic conditions can negatively impact the long-run level or growth of output. And when you're thinking about what the policies are needed as we emerge from lockdown, I think it's worth thinking about these different channels. So what are the different channels? The first, and the one from which the term originated, is unemployment. What does scarring mean in the context of unemployment? It means that short-term unemployment reduces people's long-term labour market prospects because their human capital depreciates. When they're unemployed, their skills atrophy, their labour market attachment diminishes, their physical, but probably more importantly, their mental health may suffer. All of those reduce future employment and wage prospects as well as future well-being. This is well established both in the US, UK, and in other developed countries. But there's a second form of scarring that directly affects the labour market, which I think is slightly different, which is what I would call the loss of job matching capital. And this is conceptually separate from the different the damage that results from unemployment is the economic loss resulting simply from losing a job which you labour market prospects in the future, earnings, which is education. So in most developed countries, schools have closed for extended periods, and since the point of schools is, at least in large part, to educate pupils, it would be pretty surprising if this didn't lead to a diminution in the acquisition of human capital. Then there are some sort of firm-specific ways in which you could have scarring. I mean, firms are not just about the reason for having a firm is precisely to internalize a bunch of type things which you can't just write down in contracts or spot market relationships. A firm's a sort of collection of business processes and relationships, legal, personal, and otherwise. Normally, firm creation and destruction is a source of productivity firms because less efficient firms are out of business. But the nature of this shock means that large numbers of viable firms are under threat. And to the extent they're destroyed, you're destroying that organizational capital and above and beyond other forms of damage. And then finally, the shock will, not quite finally, one more, the shock will also reduce business investment for obvious reasons. Nobody's investing now, but to the extent that investment is lower, and of course we know low investment is a big problem in the UK, that will reduce future output. And then there's a further element, in which case, what are the structural shifts which the economy will undergo as a consequence of this crisis? This is not necessarily scarring, but it will manifest itself in changes to productivity in particular sectors to which the economy will have to adjust, if either because of new laws or regulations or because of changes in behavior. We decide that restaurants have to have tables that are 2 meters apart. That will make them less productive than they otherwise would be. That will change output, employment, and value added going forward. So you have all these things which can potentially affect not what's going on now, but what the economy will look like and what the labor market will look like. What conclusions can we draw from and I've tried to do some very sort of back of the envelope numbers and assessment of the time trajectory of these impacts. I will be writing this up, but it's still very much work in progress. But I think the bottom line here, in the time I have available, is that first of all, that the concern about scarring is entirely justified. The magnitude of these potential impacts is really very large and certainly dwarfs the short-term cost of the restrictions and the policy responses that we put into place. The second thing is that the fact that there are these quite different channels, and this isn't even an exhaustive list, is often obscured in the public debate when we just talk about scarring or long-term impacts, and that makes policy making much more complex. So doing whatever it takes is the right thing to say, it's the right thing to do, and it's a good starting point, but we'll need to do whatever it takes across multiple policy direct dimensions. the third is that some of these impacts will fade out over time, but others will be persistent. And while economies are naturally resilient and that will attenuate the damage, there's no theoretical or empirical reason to believe it will repair the damage. So when Steve says, well, there is a much greater role for government intervention, and we need to make that case, it's not just about letting the market snap things back. I think that's absolutely right. But and this is the perhaps the most important point, those actions need to be quite carefully designed, and the optimal policies are likely to vary over time. In the short to medium term, the negative effects of job separations and business failures are likely to be the most important. So that actions like furlough schemes and the business support schemes to keep firms in business and keep workers employed in their current jobs is justified. But when you get to the medium long term, the channels that are likely to be most important are individual specific and relate to human capital. So it's unemployment scarring and education. So you need, in the sort of language that policymakers like to use, to pivot from those policies that are designed to preserve the way things are now to the policies that are designed to the economy that we're going to have in 3 or 5 or 10 years. So we need to move to much more active labour market policies that are not about keeping in people's jobs. They're about helping people to find new jobs or acquire new skills. And that's a really that pivot, that switch, how to make it, to me seems to be the really big challenge facing policymakers now. The bits that we have now, lending loads of money to businesses, paying firms to keep workers on, those are fine, but they're the easy bit, and their shelf life is rather limited. We do need, I think now, and this starts now, to make the case for active labour market policies that help workers find new jobs, retrain in sectors that are likely to be growth sectors. And while I think the government's done a really good job so far on relative to my expectations or past experience on things like the furlough scheme, I'm a bit worried that the Treasury seems to be entirely preoccupied now with finding exit strategies for the furlough scheme, which is broadly right, without talking about what those policies now need to look like. As Steve said, and as Tony Wilson and I and others have said before, we did have a lot of success with things like the Future Jobs Fund, and I think I'm quite worried that people in government and politics aren't yet talking about how we're going to build on that and create something that looks like that, only 10 times as big. That's probably enough for me to kick out, to kick things off, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that. We do not have a lot of questions on the chat, but I do have one question on the optimist kind of side of things for this. Do you think that the business scarring could have some good future implications about innovation of organizational structures and institutional changes that we could observe? So businesses would somehow adapt over time and build new organizational structures that could help tackle some of these effects.
You would hope so. That some, at least, of the destruction could turn out to be creative. And you might particularly hope that would be the case in, for example, transport and travel, that we will find ways of being more efficient and less carbon intensive about moving people around. You might also hope that it will be the case in terms of remote working. I think the jury is obviously very much out on that. But again, that's definitely something where you need government policy. You need to ensure that what destruction there is actually creative, and that we channel the energy that people have put into working around the crisis into working through and beyond the crisis.
That certainly is. We do need policy about that to make something out of nothing. Thank you very much for that. We're going to proceed with the second speaker for today, Geoff Tily. Geoff, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting the TUC participate in this event and all the very valuable remarks so far. I'm encouraged that there seems to be a good deal of common ground. I'm going to start with a better recovery report, which we issued last week, and I suppose in effect is our rather long, it has to be said, answer to your headline question, which I put on my slide. So yeah, so that's your question. You go on to say aligned with social, political and economic challenges, notably climate change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the report in broad terms. Then I'm going to turn to the labour market and pick up on the suggestion that you made in some other bullets that you circulated to the speakers, that full employment in the UK up to now has depended on precarious jobs and cheap labour. And I'm going to do this with an international perspective on events over the past decade, which draws on an earlier TUC report, which we issued last autumn, which got somewhat lost in the election. This is the left-hand one is that report from last autumn, and the right-hand one is the current report. Quite figured out how to see title slides in lockdown. Don't try and read that though. So go back to where we were going, and then after this sort of international perspective, I'm going to discuss a bit about supply and demand interpretations of these outcomes. And unlike Jonathan, I'm going to focus more on demand. And then lastly, I'm going to return to our present report and look at what I see as this delusion that we have to start thinking about how to pay for coronavirus policies. And we've heard in the previous sessions people thinking that thinking has changed around austerity, but to be perfectly frank, I don't hear that change of thinking when I watch the news. So to the TUC report, we regard the response to the crisis as instructive, to put it very mildly. The government interventions, so the speed and scale of what can be done and minds are sufficiently focused. Most striking, perhaps, is the Everyone In programme that brought homeless people off the streets. The changes that people have made in their lives during lockdown have demonstrated great adaptability and resilience, and the mutual aid groups that sprang up spontaneously across the country remind us of our interdependence and that people want to help and support one another. The world of work, as others have said, has been put centre stage, and we like to think that we're finding out who really keeps the country going. At the same time, of course, the poor pay and insecurity of key workers has been thrown into stark relief, and people have already mentioned, of course, the devastating intensification of health inequalities we've also seen. So looking to the future, we argue that we need new business models based on employment relationships that promote dignity, fair pay and voice at work, and an end to business models based on fragmented employment relationships, low pay and insecurity. We obviously argue that trade unions have a vital role to play in these models. We need recognition and voice in companies, continued working with government, and of course engagement in developing international rules and institutions that support universal human and labour rights in a way that they don't necessarily at the moment. Francis O'Grady has called for a National Recovery Council, which would bring together workers and employers with arrangements mirrored at regional and sectoral levels. Immediately, as lots of other people have said, the public sector must play a role in steering the recovery from the lockdown. We need to rebuild public services and strengthen the safety net. Above all, we should put the same resolve into resolving the climate crisis as we did in the pandemic. We should categorically reject the call of the usual suspects for renewed austerity. As Professor Woods of the Blavatnik School warned, we can either grow out of the crisis or we can crash out of it. Anyway, that's the manifesto over. The substance of the session is the labour market. And I want to go back to the point that full employment in the UK has depended on precarious jobs and cheap labour, a tentative point. In this report that we issued last year, we outlined how the UK labour market experience was not really greatly dissimilar to other countries. And I've shown you a couple of charts here, which hopefully you can see. On the left is jobs performance, the UK. So the left-hand chart is employment, is jobs performance. So we've got the UK employment growth in red, the OECD average employment growth in yellow, and the European Union employment growth in blue. And here, really, the UK outcome is little different to the OECD average. If I look at pre- and post-crisis growth, the OECD employment growth slowed to 1.1% on average since the crisis, compared to 1.3% a year before the crisis. UK employment marginally to 1.2% since the crisis compared to 1% before, but there's slight differences. Even the nominal wage data on the right are perhaps less different than we might think. The OECD average ahead of the crisis was around 5% a year, and since the crisis, it's been 2.5% a year. In the UK, average nominal wage growth also halved, and it halved from 4 to 2%. We do well, relatively worse on the change in real pay, in part because our inflation was lower ahead of the crisis. And obviously, I don't want to downplay the UK pay performance. We and many others have found the real pay performance since the crisis the worst in 2 centuries. But I think for analytical purposes, the important thing is the sum of the parts. Overall, labour income growth, as the sum of wages and pay, has slowed materially for the OECD from 6% to 3.5% a year, roughly. So that's a material slowdown, even if jobs growth is held up. Now, the report also includes a lot of country-level figures, which don't translate very well to PowerPoint. And I suppose I should also note that the analysis in the document is resolutely graphical rather than anything more sophisticated. But for the moment, you'll have to take my word for the next go up in the report afterwards if you're inclined. I mean, I think above all, what country-level figures show is that it's too simplistic to suggest that we have bought our recent jobs performance at the expense of real pay and conditions. If you look in the report, there are only 6 countries that have enjoyed increased real pay growth since the crisis. And I can do this in ascending order of the increase in pay growth. It's Chile, Israel, Japan, Iceland, Poland, and Germany at the top. 4 of these 6 countries that enjoyed real wage growth also saw faster growth in employment: Germany, Poland, Japan, and Chile, for what it's worth. And then conversely, at the other end, 8 out of the 10 countries that had the most severe deteriorations in employment growth also had severe deteriorations in real pay growth. So something else is going on other than a relationship between real pay and jobs here. And in the report, above all, we were concerned to show that the best way to achieve a good performance on both jobs and pay over the 2010s was to avoid austerity. So I keep talking about the report without the slides, but it's simpler, I think. And in order to show this relationship between austerity and the labour market, we switched perspective first from the labour market to the national accounts. We look at the growth of the expenditure and income measures of GDP before and after the crisis, and then we find that the GDP expenditure data shows austerity as measured by the change in growth in government final consumption and expenditure and the change in GDP growth. So we're kind of looking at what government spending is doing, it's being reduced, and GDP growth is being reduced. And we find that in 32 out of 32 OECD countries where government spending was reduced, GDP growth was also reduced. So as well as anything else, this is a categorical refutation of the notion of expansionary fiscal contraction. If you reduce government spending, it wasn't the case that other things bounced up to compensate and indeed to overcompensate. Other categories fell. The only countries where GDP growth increased were countries where government spending growth increased. And again, there's a significant overlap here that these countries where GDP growth increased were the countries that did well on both jobs and pay. So to turn to supply and demand, the analysis suggests that the most important factor in labour market outcomes has been aggregate demand. I don't want to deny a supply side factor, and that Laura's coming up next, but 6 months ago, the Resolution Foundation published a valuable report called Feel Poor, Work More. And their bottom line was that the public had responded to hardship throughout the period of austerity with an increased willingness to work. I think Martin Wolf in the FT translated it best. He said that the rise in employment looks more like a response to bad performance than a success. And the Resolution Foundation report goes on to detail the key evidence of this supply response. They talk about the stalling of a decades-long decline in average hours, a higher number of people still wanting more hours, the increased employment of women, especially single parents and older women. The Resolution Foundation also recalled the role of coercion in this, although I'm not sure they used the word, the generalised reduction in the value of benefit support, the lone parent obligation, and a very greatly intensified use of sanctions. and the rising state pension age. I would add to this list on coercion the Pernicious Trade Union Act. Now, obviously, more people who want work finding work is a good thing. But even given the reduction in aggregate demand was necessary, I'm not convinced that we can say anything about the special qualities of the UK approach, given that the international experience on average, which on this slide still, was broadly similar in terms of jobs and pay adjustment. And in fact, in the report, I do a bit of digging by country to suggest that stronger unions might actually advantage the overall adjustment, particularly in terms of labour income versus corporate profit. I mean, but it's very tentative. Fundamentally and overall, I'm concerned with the fact that any jobs or pay adjustment is a zero-sum game given the change in aggregate demand. And I'm convinced that the change in aggregate demand was fundamentally wrong-headed. For me, the consequences of the supply-side solution to a problem of demand must inevitably be bad. So lastly, I'm going to talk about demand in the context of the last chapter of our latest report, our Better Recovery report, and the chapter is headed Paying for Itself. So this next slide. We had a launch event for our report last week, and which featured Martin Sandbu of the Financial Times, and he observed that if you take demand out of the economy, it will mess up the public debt. A lot of people have learned this lesson, even if they won't admit it. And these two charts were aimed at illustrating the point. The left-hand chart shows index numbers of the level of GDP for each recovery of the past 100 years. The levels of each recovery are set at 100 for the starting point of each recovery, or the trough of the previous recession. So here you see very clearly that the current recovery is the weakest of the past century. Rather than dwell on the likely familiar right-hand chart of public debt ratio, I've done a table for the purposes of today, which I think better brings out the key points. If you look at the rightmost column, you see, and the bottom row, you see not only was GDP growth the weakest in the current recovery, but the public debt performance was the worst. In most other recoveries, the debt ratio tends to improve, not under the austerity of the past decade. And then I think the wider ranking across all these recoveries is important. Throughout the pandemic, we've heard various comparisons with the war economy. Most important for coming out of the lockdown, I think, is the recovery into peace. It is striking that the only close match to the present performance is that of the 1920s. And conversely, the best performance is on both debt and GDP is the Attlee government, although I'm leaving aside the GDP performance over the 1930s into the Second World War. We are, of course, concerned to emphasise that the Attlee government is the relevant precedent and vindicated the idea, or perhaps the ideal, that what was good for society was good for the economy. And then conversely, the policies of the 1920s were founded on the same logic of austerity. Such, as far as I am concerned, has been the unlearning of the lessons of history and the lessons of macroeconomics. Lastly, I just want to stress that I don't think the Attlee policies were just blind faith, but followed from a sort of deeply considered understanding of the nature of recession. That was part of the sort of wider thinking in economics over the 30s. And I think this thinking might still be relevant today, particularly because Anand mentioned the importance of narratives, and virtually everywhere I go, people want to talk about narratives. I hope you're still listening. I hope you're still hearing me, because I can't see the actual screen. But anyway, I should press on. So I think there's this nearly universally shared idea that the present Great Recession indicated that the economy was living beyond its means. The conclusion about the Great Depression, I think, was that the economy had been operating beyond the means of the public, rather than the public had been living beyond the means of the economy. This kind of thinking is the basis of overproduction or underconsumption theories. It's not that the economy couldn't produce anymore, it's that the economy, that the level of production in the economy was out of reach of the purchasing power in the economy. For me, the thinking explains why the defining feature of excess in both the 1920s and the 2000s was private debt inflation, not price inflation. Firms borrow to make up for shortfalls in sales, and households borrow to make up for shortfalls in income, and we get rising private debt. On this view, austerity obviously exacerbates rather than resolves the problem. You don't solve a crisis of purchasing power by cutting back pay and government consumption. The process explains why the so-called Systemic Risk Council were warning that COVID-19 strikes the world at a time when too many corporations around the world are over indebted, and then more generally, the widespread fears of recession ahead of the pandemic. So it's not just that we can build a different economy, it's rather imperative that we build a different economy. And most obvious, shrink or collapse, we should be expanding purchasing power up to meet production or to meet pre-existing levels of production. And that fundamentally is why change is affordable, because what we had before the crisis was not unaffordable, and in fact may well have fallen short of what the economy could do. So the Attlee government didn't just do fiscal policy. They did large-scale monetary reform at national and international levels. There was a significant change in the approach to trade unions, and there were nationalisations, beginning with the Bank of England. But building public services and the welfare state was central to their approach. Today, the social priorities are changed, beginning, as you say in the question, with climate change, other challenges, not least social care, and making up gravely damaged public services need to be addressed. I should lastly add that I don't for 1 minute want to underestimate the challenges of exiting the lockdown, but I think the best thing economists can do is to try and get macroeconomics straight and help the way to a more positive future, if that isn't too pompous. For me, the evidence of history is that it can be done. And I hope you heard that. So finished.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for this. A recent report by the European Foundation for Improvement of Living and Working Conditions that has been done during May and April suggests that demand is going to be a huge problem quite soon. On average, about 30% of Europeans responded that they are going to permanently or temporarily lose their contracts. So we should definitely look into that. And I think that your point connects very well with Andrew's point on universal basic services that was made on the previous panel, and we can discuss further on. We don't have questions at the moment, so I think we could proceed with our third speaker. Are you there?
Yep. Hello.
Hi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And as always, when you're the last speaker in an event like this, you do rather feel that lots of what you wanted to say has been covered by others. So I certainly won't talk for too long. I think I was gonna focus on the the labour market policy side of the discussion, which I know Steve and others have talked about already. So I think I'll just run through kind of three aspects of this crisis that we should be really aware of and should shape our how we think about the policy response, and then kind of three bits of the policy response, sort of three policies that are worth focusing on. So in terms of thinking about this crisis, I think I'll just run through kind of under the three headings: sectors, regions, and groups affected. So I think the first thing to recognise that kind of differentiates this from previous crises, at least since the 1980s, and I should have said this at the start. Usual disclaimers, but my disclaimer is I'm definitely not a macroeconomist. I count myself as barely an economist, so I'm very much coming at this from a kind of a different perspective to some. But thinking about this crisis in comparison to previous crises, if we look at the if we think about sector, this is a much more sectoral crisis than we've had at least since the 1980s, and that's kind of for the very obvious reasons that the way we have shut down the economy and then are going to open it back up is massively sectorally differentiated. So just for example, looking at the OBR's expectations for the change in sectoral output during this year, the variance on that is 3 times as large as the change in sectoral output in the last crisis, 6 times as large, sorry. So it's a really sectoral crisis. The 1980s recession was sectoral in part, but this is incredibly sectoral. So the way we think about the policy response, I think, in hospitality, non-food retail and recreation sectors and things like that, is just going to be so fundamentally different until that, not just now or in the next 3 months, but really until there's a vaccine. And that is very hard for policymakers, especially in the Treasury, who, for lots of good reasons, like it's hard politics and it involves picking winners and things like that, don't really like sectorally differentiated policy. But I don't think we can duck that. So I said that the 1980s was perhaps the last really sectoral crisis. And that was obviously also really regional in terms of the bits of the country that relied on the industries that were in decline during that period. Now, that's where I think this one differs. If we think about the sectors we're talking about, hospitality, non-food retail, recreation and leisure, things like that, they're very spread across the country. There aren't huge regional differences in where these things are done. They're service jobs done everywhere. And therefore, I think in some senses, we might be initially at least less worried about the regional spread of this crisis, with I guess a couple of exceptions. There are some bits of the country, tourist hotspots in Cumbria, Blackpool, Cornwall, Devon, etc., that are so reliant on tourism that you might be particularly scratching our head on how those economies could function in anything like the near future. Although I do know a lot of people that think they're going camping in Cornwall or Cumbria in August, so maybe I'll be proved wrong on that front. And the other regional aspect that I think is a bit tough is just London in terms of the way people commute. And I don't think people have talked about this much, but it's just, if you look at modes of commute, it's sort of more than 9 in 10 by car in every region in the country, and that drops to 50% or below in London. So I think the transport aspect of going to work for those who can't work from home does make London a bit different. But broadly, I think regions are the dog that didn't bark in this crisis. And then as in terms of other kind of demographic groups, I think lots of this has been mentioned, and as our research has shown, we're talking about in terms of the jobs affected, who's been furloughed, who's lost jobs, who's moving on to UC. We've started putting evidence out from a big survey we've done ourselves, and there's loads of other data starting to come out as soon as, including some official data, although it's made me really sad how far behind our official data publication processes and our labour force survey and things like that are compared to European countries and the US and Canada, where we already know what the unemployment rate is and things like that. But from the data we do have, we know that it's the lowest paid, the youngest and oldest adults, and to some extent women whose jobs have been most affected. The gender thing's actually quite interesting. So women are slightly more likely to be in the shutdown sectors, and they're much more likely to be key workers, whereas men are particularly concentrated in a group we call can't work from home. So are facing some risks, and certainly some health risks as the economy has been opening up. And that's because we're talking about jobs like manufacturing and construction. So the gender thing's not completely clear cut. I think there are different risks on both sides, but we've obviously had other evidence on which working adults, parents have taken on more of the parenting responsibility from IFS in recent days. And it looks like a kind of reversion back to some former patterns of childcare and working, which would be expected to exacerbate the gender pay gap, like that. So if that's what this crisis looks like for sectors, regions and different groups in the population, how does that help us think about policy? I'm going to go through 3 buckets of policy very quickly, and some of these have been spoken about before: the job retention scheme, the benefit system, and kind of active labour market policy, as it doesn't fall into those first 2 categories. So in terms of the job retention scheme, lots has been said already. I think the only things I'd add on that is coming back to my first point on sectors. I think, the Chancellor said he's going to announce quite what's going to happen before the end of May, which means he's going to do it tomorrow. And the reason, given that I don't think it's about to happen in the next 40 minutes, and the reason why he's doing it on the very last day of May is because he set himself a really hard challenge on the question of, there's sort of the 3 big questions he has to answer is: when do employers start making contributions? how the hell to do this flexible following short-time working thing in practice. Everybody agrees it's a good idea, but it's obviously quite hard to do in order to prevent fraud, and when to stop new furloughs by firms. And the reason all these questions are so hard to answer is because at the moment, the government is committed to taking a kind of a one-size-fits-all strategy across sectors, and it is so hard to find the right balancing point on those questions for kind of accountancy, for example, where there has been some furloughing and reduction in working going on, but broadly you want to be incentivizing that sector to get back up and running as quick as possible, and contrasted with hospitality, where putting any skin in the game for employers on large parts of the hospitality sector now in terms of having to make a 10 or 20% wage contribution to furloughing is just going to sort of, I think, trigger mass redundancies in those sectors. So the government's objective in kind of setting how much and when the employer contribution would be is to get the balance right between incentivizing economic activity to start happening again, but not push so hard that employers go further than they would need to in the long run on redundancies and getting rid of people, thereby undermining the whole point of the job retention scheme in the first place. And trying to do that across sectors with a one-size-fits-all approach is really hard, given the very different situations sectors are facing over the coming months. Now, there are ways the government can get around that by kind of bunging money to some sectors in other ways, rather than kind of carving up the job retention scheme. But I think if we don't face up to that, the scheme's going to kind of not be able to hold all the objectives it's got in setting the right incentives between retention of workers and getting demand going again, as we kind of move from the easy bit, which was everything's locked down, to the recovery phase, which is how do we get going again quickly enough, but not push too hard so this whole thing falls over. That's kind of some quick thoughts on the job retention scheme, and really going to be really interesting to see how the Chancellor answers those questions tomorrow. Moving to the benefit system and universal credit, I won't say much on this. We published a really big report yesterday on this topic. I think, if I think back to kind of what consumed my working life, well, I guess before outside of the election a few months ago, it was obviously Brexit and universal credit. Like two things everybody wanted to moan about were Brexit and universal credit in the weird, obviously small world of kind of welfare policy I work in. Now, I don't want to be too positive about universal credit, but if it was doing a pretty rubbish job in a lot of areas of lots of the stuff it was doing before this crisis, it has proven itself to be particularly well suited to this massive inflow of benefit claimants in a socially distanced world. The digital system has been a lifesaver compared to the old system in terms of getting people on, and the department, I think, has broadly done a really good job of turning off conditionality, processing claims, moving stuff online, doing the phone calls, making people widely aware of advances, etc. That deserves praise. That you just have to look at pictures of queues for unemployment benefits in some states of the US to see how rubbish an alternative approach would be. So that's really great. But I think the key point to take away, and I won't say too much on it, is the benefit system is going to be the safety net in this crisis for much longer than the job retention scheme's around. So all the focus has been on the job retention scheme, and there are massive inequities in terms of things like incomes and replacement rates between people who've gone onto the scheme versus fallen out work and onto universal credit. Now that's not great. And we should worry about that. But the answer, I don't think, is to kind of bring the universal credit up to job retention scheme levels, which would obviously be enormous, tomorrow, or cancel the job retention scheme tomorrow. Is to recognise that we're now in the world of phasing out the job retention scheme, but universal credit caseloads will be elevated. People will move on off the job retention scheme onto universal credit, so it should be preparing for that second wave. And the level of income support universal credit provides, while it's been increased, will need to be looked at again, I think, especially after we get this second wave in. So I definitely don't think we should be thinking about taking away the temporary increase to universal credit in April 2021. We'll be nowhere near out of the woods yet at that point, and we should be looking at prioritising more support via policies like lifting the benefit cap, changing the capital rules so that people aren't ineligible for universal credit, and channeling more support towards families with children. So the key point there, I don't want to kind of get too distracted into benefits policies. The JRS might be around for another 5 or 6 months. UC is going to be fighting this crisis for years. So yes, there are inequities at present, but the key thing is to make sure UC, which has passed its first test of getting money to people and getting people on quickly, continues to support family finances and stops this economic shock becoming a very, very deep living standards crisis. So finally, moving on to that, and the thing that UC will also have to do as it moves out of this kind of first phase of the crisis is start to think about how it doesn't just become something that delivers incomes to people, but something that starts to support people get back to work. And that brings me on to my final point, which is the kind of active labour market policy mix. Again, this has been talked about a lot. I think all I'll say is I think this is an area, actually, as Steve and Jonathan, as others have said, where we have gone through phases of doing this really well in the UK, and we do know what works. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence, some really kind of rigorous evidence from RCTs and the like of what works. So I don't think we need to wait and see quite what happens. And I think the Department for Work and Pensions should really be getting a lot of this in place now, in the expectation that you'll want schemes really up and running in kind of 5 or 6 months' time. The 3 components should be job search support and advice for everybody from day one of a claim. I think there's a lot of evidence now from the US that actually quite cheap interventions, even if it's with people who might be expected to go back to work quite quickly, can substantially reduce the amount of time people spend out of work and on benefits, and thereby be very cost effective. The second component is a much more comprehensive offer than we've had in recent years of training, advice and guidance. That should be training focused on kind of short job preparation and work readiness training. Again, there's quite a lot of evidence around what works there we should be drawing on. And the third bucket should be, as we talked about, job guarantees. I'm also going to sing the praises of the Future Jobs Fund. I think there's some really good evidence there on what works. The things we could improve about the Future Jobs Fund, certainly more of a focus on outcomes, more involvement of the private sector, but we should definitely be getting ready to do a job guarantee scheme targeted at young people and the long-term unemployed that learns from the successes of that scheme now. So if those are the 3 components of an active labour market policy, I think 2 final points to make, linking back to what I said at the start. First, we need to recognise that with the job centre staff numbers having fallen by a third over the last decade, with the amount DWP spends on employment programmes having fallen by 90%, the capacity is not there to do this. So for reasons of capacity, if nothing else, although there are loads of other good reasons to do it, that central government is going to have to work with local authorities, charities, local partnerships, as it did in successful schemes like the Future Jobs Fund, to get any of this going quickly. And I think that also links back to what I said at the start in terms of the fact that while I don't think this crisis is hugely regional in terms of its initial effects, I think it will look a lot more regional and localised as this plays out. So yes, maybe everywhere's got hospitality, so everywhere's seen a hit. The places that are going to take longer to recover, as well as some of the tourism hotspots I mentioned, are those with more deprivation, lower skills, etc. So we should be working with local partners for 2 reasons, both because there's just not enough people in central government, having slashed DWB headcounts over a decade, to do anything like what we need to do on the scale we need to do it. And secondly, as this crisis develops, we're going to start needing different local and regional strategies, and that needs local expertise. I will stop talking there. I'm very happy to participate in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that. The questions have been starting to come in, so we have a few questions for you. The first question is whether you think, I think you touched upon your finish, but I think the question is whether do we need region-specific targeted policies in terms of the effects of the pandemics, particularly for big cities like in Europe, Paris or London. And I would like to add to that we also need to work on regions that are more left behind rather than the big cities. There's a new working paper coming up from the ITP on 8 regions of the UK that we're looking into different aspects of livelihoods in poor regions of the UK. That it's going to add something to this literature. I would like to know what you think about this.
I think, yeah, as you said, I sort of kind of got to that a little bit at the end. I think another reason to my kind of pragmatic strategy of there's kind of a broad shape of a national policy response on the active labour market policy side, at least, that we'll need immediately, and we shouldn't be worrying initially about regionally differentiating that, because it's quite a regionally even crisis in its initial effects. Like, the strongest argument for that is basically this has just been so fast, this crisis, in terms of how fast it's hit the labour market. It's not a normal recession where you have a shock in the economy or a shock in a little bit of the economy, like the financial sector, and then you kind of get unemployment building up following that over a period of 9 months. This is a very different shape, and it's kind of had this phenomenal speed starting off. So if we want active labour market policy to prevent that unemployment scarring Steve talked about, we just need to get on with it. And I think that means starting with a fairly broad brush national approach, delivered by local partners because of the capacity issue I talked about. And then I think it's more as we move through this and we start to deal with some of the longer term effects, the harder cases, as you said, the more deprived areas, where I do expect this whole thing to be slower to unwind, that we'd be wanting to do much more regionally and locally targeted approaches. And given that the initial effects I talked about have been so differentiated by income, and other research has shown by earnings, by age and so forth, and the country's getting more different by age, as some of our previous research showed. Places are kind of aging apart, essentially, with older places getting older and some younger places actually getting younger. That means that I think that is evidence that we should expect areas to kind of grow apart as this crisis unfolds, local areas at least, and we should expect it to be the most deprived areas that fall behind and struggle most. I don't know if this is a very good answer, but my kind of next 6 months strategy is let's just get some active labour market policy going. We need huge investment. We probably need that to be coordinated. And then my kind of year after that strategy is now we really need to starting to think about what more we can do in the hardest hit places.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna follow on this and then open the floor to the three of you to continue on the discussion and a few other questions. Do you think, though, that we need some kind of flexibility in these kind of policies? Thinking that there might be coming a second wave coming up in September or October or even later in the year that would differentiate these places. Do we need something like a context-specific strategy for the future? Like, for example, if there's more lockdowns in a specific region, should we have some kind of flexibility to change these labor market policies, or this flexibility is not needed at the moment?
Other panelists might want to come in, but my kind of short answer is absolutely. I think we know we need something, but we will want to be flexible to what exactly happens in terms of how it develops and certainly how long it goes on for. I think one area where flexibility will be really important, and kind of I would be interested to hear what the Chancellor says on it, is the kind of the flexibility to actually dial back up the job retention scheme or pause its withdrawal, for example, if it looks like it's pushed too far in terms of pushing employers over the edge, or if we're expecting further lockdowns in a second wave. And there's other areas where we've called for flexibility, like we should just say right now that the job retention scheme remains in full furlough, 80% no employer costs for anybody who needs to who has the virus or needs to self-isolate under the test and trace regime, or needs to look after kids. So, like, there's loads of reasons why we need that kind of flexibility. We need the flexibility to bring policy back on. We need the flexibility to run stuff on for longer. We need the flexibility to do more on things like job guarantees, job centre capacity, whatever, in local areas. But the best that's needed, because any good response, any good policy should be calibrated flexibly and with reference to the context. But it's needed particularly in this crisis, because if we don't have that kind of flexibility, we're going to undermine the health policy, test and trace, preventing a second wave, etc., which is going to cause, apart from causing a lot of personal misery and health damage, which isn't my area of expertise, is going to undermine the economic recovery. So yes, flexibility always important, but particularly important when you're trying to coordinate an economic policy response with a health policy response.
I think I don't disagree with that, but I think there's possibly a more important dimension of flexibility, which is quite difficult. I think what you've seen from the Treasury so far is a desire to have clear, simple, relatively clear, simple rules. Not quite one size fits all, but they have not wanted to distinguish by sectors or geography. And I think that's for perfectly understandable political economy reasons. They think that if they start having to draw boundaries, that inevitably the pressure will be around the edges to make the scheme more liberal and more expensive. And that's almost certainly true. And they don't want to be in the business of either picking winners or picking losers. The problem is that that's going to become quite difficult to sustain in the next phase because, at some point you do have to start thinking about picking winners and picking losers, because you do have to think about those sectors which are going to shrink and will need to shrink, those sectors which hopefully will expand, and where you actually want to start encouraging people to move into jobs or to train or retrain. And I think that the dimensions of flexibility required there are really quite difficult for the Treasury. My view on going back to something that people talked about before is you do need to push out some of this decision making to the private sector, to both to down locally and to the private sector into individuals. You need to start giving people more freedom to take new jobs and to get subsidies for it, to retrain. You will need in some sectors to recognize that quite a lot of businesses will go out of business and quite a lot of people will lose their jobs. That's not easy, but the Treasury is going to have to, it's not so much about introducing flexibility at the national level, but to making sure the scheme works in a way at a national level which allows that flexibility at the local level. That's not going to be easy, but I don't think, I'm a bit worried that that doesn't seem to be where the Treasury is heading just now.
Geoff, would you like to comment something on this, or Laura? Geoff, your microphone is muted.
I was going to pick up on Angus's question. She charged me with banging on about demand, and I mean, and the structural change. I mean, I think inherent to all this. I mean, it's very impossible to disagree with anything that I've heard from Laura or Jonathan on the immediate needs for policies and labour market interventions. But I do think that the changed approach that everyone's talking about in bigger terms about public initiative on climate change and social care and public services does amount to a major change with how the government approaches the economy. I was at a session this morning, the Tony Blair Institute session this morning, which was, and there was sort of interaction between those kind of public initiatives and the sort of industry strategy initiatives that have always been around, and the regional strategy initiatives that have been around, and the calls for more British participation in high-tech manufacturing and green manufacturing and regional strategy. And so I think that all these things that were important before the crisis are increasingly important after the crisis. But I am pretty, I don't know, I want to be pretty adamant that this, to take this sort of approach does amount to a different kind of a logic to what we've had before. That suddenly everyone seems to be thinking that you can take a sort of a more social economy approach, and that would be good for the economy. So rather than we must have this fantastic private sector that pays for the public sector, there's a sort of two-way interaction there that is helpful. Well, that's not only helpful, that's profound. And I just think that we need to get this across as well as we can. So I may not be talking about as much about labour markets as we can, but I think the sort of underlying logic of what's going on, the wider thinking about a labour market where flexibility is less important and trade unions and re-regulation is more important. I don't know if everybody agrees with that, but that these are the key things, and these for me amount to major structural changes and things that have been. It amounts to addressing things that have been going on for many decades that led to a sort of economy before the crisis that wasn't the sort of economy we wanted. And if we kind of think that we're constrained by the economy that we had before the crisis, then we're tying our hands. And austerity thinking is tying our hands to that economy. So if we can get over this and start to think that we can have a different economy with a different approach to the labour market, then that's, I think, is the most important step we can take.
Okay, thank you very much, Geoff. I think based on this changing structure of the economy, we have some peer pressure from the chat to shift the discussion towards what we think about better jobs, the transformation of the labor markets, and what happened between functionalities and dysfunctionalities of the of working from home. So there are a few points in regards to these. There is an initial question that was addressed to the first panel, but I think it's relevant to this one, and it's whether we think there's any trend that this kind of working from home allows for a structural transformation that will allow for digital nomads. People would be working away from their and living away from their work, and that will somehow change labor markets structurally over the next few years. And another question that we see a lot coming up is, what do we think about better jobs, and how do we think these could be achieved? What institutions do we need in order to get into these kind of better jobs? What kind of skills transformation do we think to see? How can we deal with the scarring effect that Jonathan described in the beginning? Therefore, I would like to see what do you think about these kind of questions.
Happy to pick up the working from Geoff. Sorry, Geoff, you might have been just about to come in. I was just going to come in on the working from home point. I've been thinking a bit about this working from home point, and I think I mentioned we did a big survey of people of 6,000 adults recently in terms of how people have been affected in their jobs, benefits, incomes, and outlook by the coronavirus outbreak. We asked about working from home, and we asked people in work whether they regularly work from home before the crisis, whether they were during the crisis, and whether they think they'll do more in future. And obviously, lots of people are working from home, more than half right now, and of those that can, lots think that I think around a third think they'll work from home a lot more in future. I think the two things I'd say on that is working from home was one of those things kind of everybody was getting really excited about in phases before the crisis due to technology making it more and more possible, and we've all got very used to the technology, yes, well, with a few hiccups every now and then, as is being demonstrated right now. But if you look at the trends pre-crisis in the labour force survey, you don't see over 2 or 3 decades massive increases in the proportion of people who work from home all the time, so are kind of fully remote workers. It trends up very, very gently, but very slowly. What you see a much stronger increase in is people that work from home maybe 1 or 2 days a week. And I think the best way to predict the future is to kind of think about what's happening in the moment you're in, but also look at the trends we've been getting from the past. And I kind of think there's good reason to believe, in the short term, due to kind of social distancing, meaning maybe smaller or less dense offices, but still offices. But also the things that we're probably all missing right now in terms of being in an office with our colleagues, or I certainly am. I think we're going to be moving towards more part-time working from home, but I don't think there's going to be a working from home revolution. And I think this conversation is almost entirely going to remain about higher earners, who are the ones who are working from home at the moment and think they will work from home more in the future. So if the conversation we're now moving on to is about better jobs, bluntly, I think it's the people who've already got the good jobs who are in this, like, how much are we going to work from home in the future question. And the better jobs conversation is just elsewhere. It's about the can't work from home group, the key workers in the shutdown sectors, where I'm sorry, but I don't know that there's any technology that is going to allow a barman to pull a pipe from home. So that's just a different conversation.
I think Henrietta and Ruth in the comments agree with you, and they think that we should structure the discussion about better jobs and what we mean with them, and whether there are better jobs for the people or better jobs for the future structural changes of the economy or the future transformations based on AI and different technologies. Does Geoff or Jonathan have anything to add in regards to this?
I mean, I think the key point is it puts a spotlight and it reinforces existing inequalities that some of us are very comfortable working from home. We've demonstrated that it's relatively easy, and we can probably do more of it without harming our work, and particularly if we can go into the office a bit. I mean, these lead to macro structural changes. Of course, there are implications for commercial property. There's implications for online retail, perhaps not the greatest sector in terms of the treatment of workers. So there are some implications here, but the bottom line is it's exposing these inequalities, and the need to get to something different in the long term. Maybe it can be harnessed in a constructive way, but the inequalities have been exacerbated, and the fundamental thing remains the need to do something about that and to get to better work all around. And there was also a question about better jobs. If what everybody is saying and what we hope is true, that the government is going to be playing a more important role in the labour market and indeed in directing what the economy does, then the government should be able to ensure that these jobs are better jobs. We've for a long time everyone calls for sort of kept conditionality around procurement and things like that. I think France have been announcing massive car subsidies and the quid pro quos, various conditions for better workers. So that there are all these things that can be done within the sorts of initiatives that we're talking about. The fundamental question is whether they will be done. That's all.
Yes, I mean I agree with all of that, and I think I agree with Laura that I don't see this leading to a huge structural change in people working from home. It has, as she says, and as both of Laura and Geoff said, illustrated that some of us have a lot more flexibility than others, and I think that means that the agenda going forward has to be on thinking about how you extend the sorts of privileges and flexibilities that some of us have across other parts of the workforce and to other workers. I mean, I think one thing that has struck me about this, relating to the work that Howard Reed and I did with Andrew on universal basic services Henrietta a while back, is that one of the arguments we made there was that access to the internet, to a smartphone and or Wi-Fi and or broadband was, in a sense, essential to participation in society and should be viewed as such, leaving aside the questions of how it's financed and delivered, but nonetheless a sort of philosophical point that this is now a necessity for from any sort of capabilities-based analysis to participating fully in society as opposed to being precarious, marginalized fringe. And I think this crisis has obviously, we were slightly mocked by some people at the time, and then Labour, of course, during the election campaign was even more mocked for claiming, that the internet was a human right or whatever. But the fact is that, as I said, leaving aside the question of how it's financed or delivered, that case, I think, has been completely vindicated. And so thinking about what it is that you need to, not just to survive, but to participate in society, and how we extend those privileges of participation more widely, seems to me to be the agenda we should be thinking about. Not that I necessarily have the answers.
I completely agree with that, and I think the crisis showed a lot of signs about that. There were there's a massive explosion in buying webcams and different kinds of stuff for internet connection that people didn't used to have before the crisis, which means that there was not enough spreading around that. And there are new evidence showing that broadband, even in the UK and Europe, is not as widely spread as we think it is. I think one of the questions that rises from the discussion, and I'm interested in, is whether you, Jonathan, you think that this kind of short-term to mid-term transformation allows us to better model future structural transformation in terms of the labor markets that will come from artificial intelligence or the changing nature of work, and therefore better predict and make better policies or institutions in order to foresee these changes and adapt better when they come or before they come.
I mean, my instinct is always that trying to predict the future of the economy or labor market is, you said two things, and and it's important to distinguish it. There's trying to predict the future of the economy and labor market, and then making sure that you have the right institutions, policies, and mechanisms to cope with that. And my instinct has always been much more that one should focus on the second rather than the first. We're not very good at predicting what the jobs or the jobs of the future or the sectors of the future will be. But we could certainly be a lot better at having the right institutional mechanisms, policies to ensure that we're better prepared for that. And that seems to me to be the task. Can we learn from this? Well, I mean, I think we certainly learned some pretty important high-level lessons about the necessary, about how our systems on everything from scientific decision making through to the welfare system ought to be more resilient because they've clearly come up short in a number of respects, and one would hope we would learn from that.
Let me rephrase predict, and I was trying to say that maybe what we're going to learn is that how transformations work better in labor markets than predicting what the next one will be and what it will do. Yeah. But
well, I mean, we learned quite a bit from the last one on the upside and downside. We learned that actually with reasonably good labor market policies, that the UK labor market was able to, we didn't have the sort of long-term unemployment and scarring effects after the last recession that we did after the 1979 one, and that was and we had learned from some of our mistakes. So equally, as Geoff said, we made some new mistakes, and no doubt that will be the case. That will be the case here as well. What have we learned so far? I'm not quite sure yet, because except we've learned, as Laura said, we've learned some things about delivery, and universal credit in delivery terms has indeed been a success during this crisis. So what will we learn about the nature of structural transformations and how you cope with them? I think it's probably too early to say yet.
Yeah, but probably. I have a last question to all three of you, and then I think through that we're going to link it to the first panel and invite Henrietta and Angus to give their comments and ideas on this. So, do you think that through this crisis we've learned how we could do institutional changes and transformations quite quickly? For example, we know that in a few countries, e-governance or the distribution of funds through universal credit and subsidies was super fast. For example, in Greece, we basically reformed all of our e-governance system in 2 weeks, something that was never done in 2 decades, maybe. And do we think that we can keep this as a good example, not just in Greece, but in Europe and even more to developing countries, in order how to quickly do some institutional reforms that otherwise would have been made in decades or even longer periods? And do we think that will help us getting into a framework of universal basic services or a more equal distribution of services in order to allow for better jobs in the future?
I don't mind saying yes. We have learned some things from this crisis. The government's response was basically very, very encouraging. Money, there was an MMT question I saw. This money was found, whatever you think about MMT. The idea that there is no money left is completely discredited, really. Whether or not you believe in MMT, but you could say the same for the global financial crisis. Very, very, very briefly, during the global financial crisis, the consent was hurled at the problem. The issue came afterwards when there was Jonathan used the word pivot in a different context, but there was a pivot to a different approach, and all the things we learned that we could do in the global financial crisis evaporated basically. So yeah, well, let's hope. But maybe this brings it into sharper relief, given the economic context wasn't the same. This brings it into such sharp relief, not only what we can do in a very short period of time, but also what the economy looks like, or what the economy did look like in the run up to the crisis. So maybe that would be enough. But I think we have to keep pressing as hard as we possibly can to say that these kinds of actions can be continued into the recovery economy to aim at something better. I don't think it will happen just like that.
I didn't have a great deal to add. I think there's some really interesting examples of kind of that change happening. I guess the cop-out answer for the UK, at least, is to say it's kind of it's too early to tell. I mean, I think there's areas where you can see quite how quickly things mobilise. Sort of a Tory government moving to pay the wages of a third of private sector workers and doing it really quickly, and using kind of the institutions that were available to do that is positive. But in terms of kind of some of the structural changes we've been talking about through these two panels, I don't think it's impossible, but I haven't seen enough evidence to make a judgment either way yet.
Jonathan, you have your mic open.
Yes, I mean, I think in terms of what have we learned? Yes, I mean, I guess what we've learned is that the Treasury can act fast and throw billions of pounds of money in a coherent and coordinated way quite well again, and we did that 10 years ago, we did that again now, and that's a good thing. I mean, I think what it has, however, shed rather a less flattering light on some other bits of the British state. In particular, what I have to say, I've been pretty disappointed by the fact that what I thought was a pretty good set of mechanisms for ensuring the translation of science into public policy turned out to be less than optimal. And then the sort of basic on the ground actually delivering things. The fact that we have known, I think, for at least 3 months that we would need at some point a proper track, test, trace, isolate system, whatever you want to call it, and that even though we're actually talking about something that's relatively modest, tens of thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands of people, that it's still, pretty ramshackle. Doesn't really reflect that well on us, and one hope the government might learn that we all might actually learn something about this, and perhaps be a bit less snooty about other countries in the future.
I certainly hope that Europe will follow that example too, even though they're taking some strategic steps towards new decisions and better decisions, particularly through yesterday's funding decision by the European Commission. With that, I'd like to invite Henrietta and Angus, who are very active on the chat, to share their views on this discussion.
The first thing to say is it's been a wonderful afternoon and a great set of interventions from all the panelists. Thank you so much, and from all of the people raising different kinds of questions. I think the point I'd like to return to is the gap between a discussion which goes on in the press that says we need a new economy, we need a new approach, we need to make sure we address climate change, all of these things that have been talked about, and then a total lack of any kind of detailed thinking about how this might go on. So if we were just to take a view, which is one I share, that now we're living in a situation where we have a number of very complex systems interacting with each other. So we have a systemic approach to this, so the kind of approach that's been currently taken in the new thinking in the OECD, with which the Rebuilding Macroeconomics team has been engaging a lot. Then under those kinds of circumstances, we can quite simply say that what we saw with COVID and the pandemic was that it revealed that there were a number of very weak links or intersections between all of these complex systems. So we started with a health crisis, which suddenly became a financial crisis, a transport crisis, a care. So in other words, we had cascading failures through several different systems. Now, what we could learn from that cascading set of failures is that we can do it the other way around. In other words, we can create a set of cascading positives. So one of the cascading positives here would be to think about how we invest in renewable energy. So there is a renewable energy trajectory, which is extremely positive, but just because of what's happening now with the COVID pandemic, we had a small window of that. And then everybody has said, immediately, Irina and all these other people have started to say, guess what? Investment figures for renewable energy is falling. So therefore, we can't have any green growth and green deals. So you can see immediately that instead of sticking to a kind of a thought-through plan of how you might shape your economy to do a number of different kinds of things, and how you therefore might shape markets, which is after all we do all the time, and shape the labour market to follow that, we've started thinking about how we can get things back on track. But as we all know, what the track we were on before was not a great track. In fact, most of us wanted to get off it. So I'm worried about the fact that there could be lots of chat about building back better and, today is tomorrow and all the rest of it, but very little actual action. And whilst that space is empty, this is something I think that a group of people like Rebuilding Macroeconomics can do by reaching out to all of you who've been involved in the discussion this afternoon, and also in particularly the panelists, and thinking through these things. So, Angus, that's my provocation to you.
Let me pick up your point on cascading failures and the idea of turning into cascading successes. You see, this is quite a fundamentally different way of approaching economics. But if we look at the last decade, we've had global financial crisis, then we've had nationalism, which started off in a few little countries, but all of a sudden spread all over the world, just about. The idea of some parts of society, there's deaths of despair, very, very small places, all of a sudden becoming not so small, where life expectancy is declining. And now they have COVID, and they all have this pandemic effect, this exponential effect, which is what catches us by surprise all the time. And the thing is that even though people talk about them possibly happening, like Bill Gates and his famous TED talk talking about basically COVID 5 years ago, as long as they're outside of our models, then we can't really bring them into our imagination and say, well, it really could have happened, and this is what the effect would be, and this is how we need to take some precautions against these sort of things. So what might precautions look like of a more, a less fragile economic structure than the one based purely on efficiency? So more resilience might be the the job retention scheme. We have enough data that we know jobs by remoteness of working capability now. So we have indices of this. We know them by regions and across sectors. We know how integrated these sectors are into the rest of the economy by the input-output table. So it's not just that it's a sector that everybody's heard of. It's where do you sit in the input-output chain? So if I take you out of the puzzle, does the whole thing collapse? If so, they're the ones who want to be targeted, thinking about having more permanent job retention schemes, possibly as a backstop, all of which is designed to stop these cascading failures we keep having and making the thing more resilient. And the other aspect I thought was extraordinary from this crisis was, frankly, how when the government put out the call for ventilators to be made by the private sector, and you've got the greater good of the British names, they didn't deliver. So is public sector and some of our universities who are connected to the public sector, are they not capable of doing this stuff? It's not been popular at all in the past, I understand that, but you cannot rely, it seems, on for certain things on the private sector in an emergency. So my question is, the way that we envisage the macroeconomy as a more resilient system, what that would mean for jobs and therefore job policy, because that's how we need to sort of approach jobs in the future, I think, rather than simply doing what I'm afraid we do at the moment, whatever wage rates are, and these poor chaps who drive back and forwards every night, delivering people's food or whatever they do, saying, well, that's the market forces, and, the Uber drivers, that's just the market forces. That's not good enough, because actually leave large parts very exposed. And I think that you can't answer this question if you don't bring morals back into the macroeconomic debate, I'm afraid. So that's my thoughts on it. They're sort of quite high level, but that's sort of the direction that we're going in. How do you build more resilient macroeconomic systems rather than just make them focusing on the lines of efficiency? So that's the direction we're traveling. But let me say, for my part, I thought the presentations were fantastic and very, very interesting, very stimulating. And so can I thank the speakers very much indeed for participating. It was absolutely fascinating. And I'll leave you, Henrietta, the final word.
Well, thank you very much, Angus. I mean, I think the question of resilience is quite crucial, but I think that has to depend, in a sense, on having perhaps a different set of data about the economy too. So this is something that we've been thinking about, is what is the relationship between the sort of the macro data and the micro data we need here? Because looking at the very local level of what's happening to people's quality of life, one of the difficulties there is understanding why particular parts of the UK are suffering or have suffered in the way that they have, and what we can do about that in the future going forward, if we're talking about how we put all of this together. And creating resilience at the local level is quite a difficult task. But understanding how it's working is really about the impact of macroeconomic policies on quality of life, right? And that process requires perhaps a different kind of data set from the one we've had. Certainly one that operates more in real time. And that's sort of interesting things that have been coming out of sort of thinking of Andy Haldane and others. But perhaps it's also that when we think about new kinds of data, it allows us to think about new kinds of models, because we're asking different kinds of questions. So part of the moral position that you're asking requires us to think about shaping markets that deliver different kinds of outcomes. And that's a huge challenge, but it's enormously important for the labour market that we start to think about that, rather than, this is the point I started with right at the beginning of the afternoon, talking about what was happening to small and medium enterprises and micro enterprise, because they're very, very important in the economy, and a huge number of them are just going to go. So if we then just decide that we're going to have a standard way of getting them back, so the standard way of how quick is it to open up a business, all of those kinds of things, which are the usual ways in which we talk about how do we stimulate the creation of these small businesses. Then, of course, first of all, we're going to have the same kind of small business. But second of all, we're not going to have a very resilient form of small business necessarily. So it's thinking about how we might change that process of what do these small businesses deliver on, because they can't exist for the future just delivering on craft beers, soda bread, and specialist fashion items. And this is a difficulty. We'd already created a very bifurcated economy at that local level, and it needs considerable rethinking, I think. Anyway, that's my last thought. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you also to our two wonderful chairs, Andrew Percy and George Melios. We're very grateful to you for guiding the discussion so skillfully. And we hope that we will see many of you who've been panelists and participants back at the next of the Rebuilding Macroeconomics event. And we will welcome you back then. So thank you very much and have a good evening.